What if a civilization we barely understand managed to build a machine so precise, so perfectly engineered, that modern scientists still can't explain how it works, or why it exists at all? Deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, in a chamber with no hieroglyphs, no inscriptions, and no signs of royal burial, lie 5 granite beams, each weighing 70 tons, stacked with deliberate air gaps between them. Engineers say it's a structural feature, but then there are the scorch marks, burned stone on the ceiling, cracked beams twisted by an internal blast, salt crusts formed only when superheated hydrogen races upward through stone. Something didn't collapse here, something exploded from within, and here's the part that makes no sense. The entire chamber resonates at 440 Hz, the same frequency Nikola Tesla used when he tried to send electricity wirelessly through the Earth. The granite in the walls is 85% quartz, piezoelectric material that generates voltage when compressed. The outer shell was once coated in insulating white limestone. Beneath the pyramid is an aquifer, exactly like the one Tesla built his Wardenclyffe Tower upon. 2 structures separated by thousands of years, using the same materials, same principles, and tuned to the same harmonic frequency of the planet. Tesla believed the Earth itself was a giant conductor of energy. He believed anyone, anywhere, could tap into it. And in his notes seized by the US government the night he died, Tesla wrote something strange. To understand the Earth's energy, one must study the pyramids. They are not what we think. Then, just like the Great Pyramid, Tesla's project was suddenly and violently silenced. His tower was demolished, his funding vanished, his work disappeared into government vaults. And that raises the impossible question: did Tesla rediscover a technology that existed long before recorded history? A technology that powered an ancient world, was erased in a global cataclysm, and was never meant to resurface? Because if he did, both civilizations, ancient and modern, suffered the exact same fate. They built a machine that could have given the world free, unlimited energy, and someone, or something, made sure it would never be used. Now, before we go any further down this rabbit hole, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. And now, with that said, let's take a slow breath, let the noise of the day fall away, and step quietly into tonight's story. It's 3 a.m. in the King's Chamber. The air tastes like stone dust and cool metal, the kind of dryness that settles on your tongue. Granite presses close on all sides, dark blocks rising in tight planes that swallow your breath. Your fingertips find a faint grain, then a sudden polish, as if some patient hand once ground these surfaces until they kept their own steady calm. The light from your headlamp crawls along a seam that slips into shadow and never breaks. In the quiet, the room feels poised, like a tool laid down mid-task, waiting for a signal that no one gives anymore. You stand still and the room answers with its own weight. The joints between blocks vanish as your eyes adjust. Edges meet like precision parts in a machine, not like stones set for mourning. There's no writing to catch your light, no paint, no carved prayers. Just flat planes and perfect corners, a geometry so strict it starts to feel musical. You shift your boot and hear the soft rasp call back. A tiny echo curling along the walls as if the chamber is listening to you and measuring your step against some buried standard. Look upward, and another story shows itself. The ceiling carries long, dark streaks that climb across the stone like the path of a flame that moved fast and left a record of its run. There's a crack through a 70-ton beam, not a hairline but a straight deliberate wound. Along the walls, thin crusts sparkle where salt has grown on the stone skin, as if vapour rushed, cooled, and crystallized in a single event that had nothing to do with candles or funeral smoke. The patterns look organized by pressure, not by ritual. Now for the part that pulls a thread you can't ignore. When modern teams test this chamber, it settles on a tone. The numbers point to 440 Hz, the same note musicians call A. It's the reference tone orchestras use to agree on pitch, and it's also the frequency tied in studies to early wireless power experiments by Nikola Tesla, who worked with resonance like a conductor, teasing sound from a vast instrument. Here, inside stone cut 5,000 years ago, the room itself likes A. Elsewhere in Egypt, a royal burial speaks loudly. You find stars painted on ceilings, passages inked with spells, names circled in protective marks. Even small tombs swing with colour and instructions for the soul. But the most famous tomb of them all gives you only material and math. No cartouche, no story, no lament, just structure. The quiet doesn't feel empty. It feels purposeful, as if these walls have a job and decorative chatter would only get in the way. Across an ocean and a long span of time, Tesla tuned coils and towers to match what he called the planet's natural rhythm. He drove electrical pulses into the ground and listened for the return, a stronger wave echoing through the earth like a bell struck at its favourite note. He believed the planet could carry energy if you asked it the right way, with the right timing, not by forcing power through wires, but by leaning into resonance and letting the earth help. If a room likes 440 Hz, that doesn't appear by luck. It comes from what it holds and how it's shaped. A volume that traps sound, dimensions set to encourage standing waves, surfaces polished to reduce loss. Add granite's mass and density, and you get a chamber that settles on a tone because its body demands it. Engineers run these checks on tanks, bridges, and concert halls. Accident is possible, of course. But when accident aligns with a tone famous in both music and early energy experiments, the pattern sharpens. Granite from Aswan carries high quartz content. Quartz responds to pressure by producing charge, the piezoelectric effect. It's the quiet trick inside a watch crystal and a lighter spark. When you stress a crystal, it makes voltage. When you apply an oscillating pressure, like a tone, the crystal can give a steady electrical whisper that becomes louder if the vibration stays steady and strong. In a room lined with quartz-rich stone, a sustained note isn't just sound, it may be a switch. The idea that this chamber was cut to serve a frequency isn't a mainstream claim. Critics counter that resonance tests in ancient rooms can vary with equipment and setup, and that any large cavity will emphasize certain tones just by being a cavity. Others dismiss chemical or electrical readings as later contamination, or as misread mineral leaching. It's fair to question methods, but question long enough, and the material choices still stand. Heavy granite, high quartz, matched seams, and a frequency that keeps returning in test after test. There are hints in old notebooks that the pyramids shaped Tesla's thinking. Supporters suggest he studied them not for history but for physics, seeing in their form a lesson about how structure guides energy. The Earth was, to him, a conductor. Water in the ground was a pathway. A tuned system could feed the planet's own circuits and ride the return wave. He treated energy like music, rhythm, resonance, and repeatable notes. If a stone chamber already sang the note he favoured, you can see why the shape would catch his eye. Back in the king's chamber, the precision keeps showing up in small ways. Tap the granite coffer with your knuckle, and it gives a pure, bell-like response. Shine your beam along the floor and the plane runs true. The corners meet with no filler. This is not how you decorate for grief. This is how you build for performance. A machine needs tight tolerances because energy slips away at every gap. A tomb needs story. Yet the story here is mute, and the tolerances are the loudest thing in the room. Think about how a frequency becomes a tool. In radio, a tuned circuit selects a station. In ultrasound, a transducer turns vibration into usable images. Here, if pressure waves move through the stone at the right pitch, the quartz inside could respond by producing charge along its faces. Thousands of crystals aligned in large blocks could drift toward a shared rhythm, like many small clocks syncing to the same beat. The combined effect would be larger than any one crystal on its own. The scars suggest the system didn't always behave. Where gas might have pooled, the heat marks gather. Where pressure would have focused, the crack sits. Salt tells of moisture turned to vapour and then to mineral skin. Not from slow seepage, but from fast, hot movement. If a resonant device ran out of control, or if the medium inside shifted suddenly, power could rise in a way no one planned to stop. That scenario fits the layout better than theft or earthquake, at least to those who study the marks as clues, not as stains. Imagine a crew here in deep antiquity, not carving prayers, but checking clearances. A worker with a lamp leans a shaved straight edge against a block and nods. Another listens for the beating note as runners strike a drum down the hall. They don't need pigment, they need a clean pitch. It's a different kind of devotion, one that treats stone as part of a larger field rather than a wall for a story. The ritual is the calibration. Some whisper that Tesla read the pyramid like a manual written in geometry and material, not in words. They say he didn't invent the song, he heard it again, and he tried to play it with steel, copper and groundwater where the coast meets the Atlantic. It's speculation, yes, but it carries a certain pull when you stand in this chamber and feel the shape of a tone gather around you with no instrument in sight. The question then hardens into two edges. Either two separate cultures settled on the same key by chance, a room in Egypt and a lab in America favouring 440 Hz for unrelated reasons. Or there's a shared logic running under both. The first answer asks for coincidence, the second asks for intent. Neither is easy to accept without more proof, yet the air here seems to vibrate with the second. You run a hand across the wall again. The surface is cool and fine. Your breath sends a small wave out and the room almost swallows it, as if saving the space for a louder voice. A is waiting somewhere in the stone, and if a chamber designed in another age shows that note, the next step is to find what was meant to play it. Midnight in the King's Chamber holds its own weather. The air tastes dusty and cool, like a cellar after rain. Your palm finds granite that feels faintly warm, as if it keeps the day inside it. The walls rise without a single line of writing to tell you who lay here, or why these stones were shaped so carefully. No prayers drift along the courses, no names, just bare rock, squared and joined, waiting in a quiet that sounds almost like breath when you hold yours. Now let the frame widen. South along the Nile, the Valley of the Kings unrolls in colour and chanting. Even a minor official's resting place carries ceiling stars, spells painted in lapis and ochre, instructions for the journey through the night sky. Here, in Egypt's most famous monument, that world of pigment is absent. No maps of the underworld, no sacred lists or protective hymns. The contrast lands softly, but it lands. Sometimes what's missing tells the louder story. People often point to thieves. Robbers slip in, take the gold, the stone boxes, the precious jars, and they did in many places. But chisel marks carved into bedrock do not melt into a camel caravan. Wall art is stubborn. It takes months to carve and longer to erase, and there is no market for verses chipped off stone in the dark. The common target is metal and gemstone, easy to carry and easy to sell. That leaves a question sitting in the cool air beside you. If thieves erased an entire funerary program, why spare the most valuable resources of all, time and labour, on something that gives no quick profit? The floor tilts almost imperceptibly underfoot when you step, because the whole structure sits true to a level that modern surveyors still nod at. The base stretches across 13 acres, yet its height varies by only 3/4 of an inch. That kind of accuracy does not happen by accident. It comes from weeks of water levels, strings and sighting lines, or from methods we have not fully retraced. On the outside, long ago, casing stones in bright limestone closed every seam. Travellers from centuries past wrote of surfaces so even the joints hid from the eye. The pyramid would have flashed sunlight by day and by moon looked like a pale blade laid against the stars. Inside this chamber, a granite coffer waits. You run your fingers along its edge and feel the faint bite of toolwork, then the smoother plane where surfaces were ground flat. It cannot fit through the passages as they stand. That means the builders placed it during construction. Tap it gently and the stone replies with a steady tone. Not a clatter, a note. Some whisper that its dimensions mirror proportions found in the whole monument, as if scale nested within scale. Others dismiss that as pattern hunting. Yet the coffer's presence makes you wonder why something tuned to sing sits in a room with no words. Follow the plan down and up. The interior layout reads less like a hallway for a procession and more like ducting. Narrow shafts angle away at specific degrees. They are too small for people, but perfect for gases, pressure and airflow. The corridor angles feel chosen for function, not ceremony. Turn a corner, and the sound changes under your feet, as though the passages were shaped to manage reflections. Some listen here and say the chambers map frequencies onto stone, with volumes and dimensions chosen to set standing waves in place. Critics counter that these shapes may be structural compromises. The debate lingers in the dust, but the geometry refuses to stop asking. If you were designing an airplane hangar, you would not lace the roof with frescoes. If you were building a cathedral, you might spare no carving on every column. This building moves in the opposite direction from the places we know are tombs. It spends effort on fit, on angle, on the strict marriage of mass and shape. The effect feels closer to an engine room that wears the clothing of a monument. Supporters suggest the pyramid operates like a system designed to shepherd energy, from ground to chamber, from chamber to sky. Others prefer the safer label of symbolism. The stones do not vote. They sit with their angles in place and keep holding the question. Look for funerary markers and your hands come back empty. No canopic jar niches, no long corridors of carved spells, no resin stains or broken shrines. The chamber does not smell of old oils, it smells like stone. In the Valley of the Kings, small rooms can be crowded with the tools of eternity, even when thieves have passed through. Here there is space, as if the empty itself was part of the plan. It is a different kind of care. The coffer draws you in again. Its granite is hard and full of crystalline sparkle. Strike it and hear the clean ring die away along the walls. Some note that its ratios echo measures found elsewhere in the structure and embedded mathematics. Others argue that a rectangle fits a rectangle, and coincidence can wear the robe of intention. Yet the acoustic behaviour is not hypothetical. The ear hears. It is not ceremony. It is physics in a room. Consider the shafts. Each one holds a tight angle and a narrow throat as if built to guide flow. Supporters suggest they acted as pressure channels, routing gases upward toward control points where resonance could do work. Others point to star alignments, ritual or ventilation functions. The stone gives only the hard data, dimensions, gradients, endpoints. Your fingertips can gather that better than any debate, tracing edges that never wander from their line. The arrangement of spaces feels less like a royal walk and more like a circuit. The Grand Gallery climbs with steps that jut like ledges. The King's Chamber sits where a node might sit in a design. When you whisper, your voice lingers and folds, not once, but again and again. If it was meant for song, it is suited for a choir of stone. If it was meant for working forces, it is suited for tuning them. The choices, one by one, walk away from mortuary habits and toward function. Supporters suggest a different story of origin. Perhaps later dynasties found something older on the plateau. They could have reused it, recast it in their image, and wove it into their lore. Others dismiss that and hold firm to the traditional timeline. The record here is thin. What we do know is what we can touch, a machine-like precision that does not match the narrative of painted walls and guiding texts. When two frames do not match, one must bend, or both must be wrong in part. Now draw a quiet line forward to another coastline. A man in a long coat studies blueprints under a swinging lamp. ink smudged on his fingers. Outside, brackish ground sits over an aquifer, and a tower of wood and steel points at the night. He does not carve prayers into planks. He drives copper deep into wet earth. He worries about frequency, about resonance, about how to make a system breathe energy in and out with the world beneath it. He names none of it for kings. If the stones at Giza hide a purpose that does not fit a funeral, the echo might live far from desert wind. Somewhere a century ago, another set of hands tried to build the same logic, using coils and cables instead of granite and limestone. The path leads there next, and the night on that shore carries a hum of its own. Midnight holds the room in a cool grip. The high mountain air feels thin and metallic, and the wooden floor trembles under your boots. In the center of the Colorado Springs lab, a tall coil sings in a blue-white crown. Arcs jump 20 feet with a dry crack that you feel in your ribs. On the dirt outside, bare bulbs pushed into the ground bloom with soft light. No wires, just earth, sky, and a man steadying a lever with one hand while the other shields his eyes from the glare. The smell carries a sting of ozone and varnish. Paper curls on a nearby table, edges browned by stray sparks, while a metal sphere hums with a tone you can't place, low and steady, like a train heard through miles of night. Tesla watches the glow spread from bulb to bulb, as if the ground itself were a cable. He nods once, almost to himself. In his notes, the line is simple. The Earth behaves as a conductor when struck at the right rhythm. He treats the planet like a tuned drum. He hits it and waits to see if the echo grows stronger on the return. Here's the belief he carries like a compass, and it isn't a small one. The Earth isn't only a rock flying through space. It is a resonant electrical body, a system that can be driven at harmonics the way a glass sings when your finger traces the rim. When energy is fed at the correct rate, the charge moves farther with less effort. He isn't trying to push power through air alone. He's trying to make the world itself carry the load, like a bell sending vibration through its whole frame. In these midnight runs, he stabs pulses into the ground and then measures the rebound. He records that the returning waves sometimes carry more than he sent, as if the medium joined in. The data points stack in quiet confidence across a page. Not drama, just values and timing. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Amplification at harmonics suggests a planetary scale circuit. The lab windows rattle under the steady rhythm. The bulbs in the soil flicker, then hold. You can hear his assistant stop breathing to listen for the beat under the crackle. Months later, the sea air near Shoreham tastes of salt and damp copper. Wardenclyffe rises from sand and scrub pines like a wooden skeleton. Beneath that tower, the ground is wet, layered with water that moves and breathes. Long Island sits on a thick aquifer. He picked it with care. The water table sits close enough to touch with steel and pipe, deep enough to draw a steady ground. Some whisper he looked for moving water because it behaves like a guide, letting electrical waves travel with less loss. Others dismiss that as romance. Still, he digs, not just a few feet. He sends iron and copper down through sand and clay, chasing the cool layer below in a pattern that looks less like a foundation and more like roots. He builds downward as much as upward. Above ground, coils and capacitors nest in an insulated shell. Below, copper veins reach into the damp. The plane, if you trace it with a finger, feels plain. Stop wasting energy into the air and couple it to the crust. Use the earth as the cable, and water as the contact. Copper plates bind to the rods in careful stacks. Resin, tar, and ceramics form barriers where power shouldn't leak. Everything is about loss and control. Keep charge from bleeding sideways. Make it rise and fall on schedule, like a breath under a singer's note. Tesla talks about resonance the way a musician talks about key. He says the system answers best when you speak in its own language. You can hear the patience in that approach. It isn't brute force, it's timing. He sees a network of such towers, each tuned to the world's low notes, each pulsing energy down through the ground and back up where needed. A ship at sea would raise a mast and drink from the field. A village would plant a rod and light its homes. The idea of wires strung across fields looks from here like the horse cart beside a locomotive. Supporters suggest the cost to lay copper across continents pushed him toward the planet as conductor model. Critics counter that power spread in soil is too diffuse. He keeps building anyway. Walk around the base and the tower tells you a quiet truth. Its shell is insulation as much as skin. He uses layers the way the old stone builders use limestone to keep charge where it can do work. Inside the core, coils swell and contract at set rates, filling and emptying like lungs. The frequency is low, but the voltage is high, a strange marriage that lets energy travel without stripping the air to flame. He wants the earth to ring, not burn. Look at the long drawing pinned to the wall and you notice the parallels that tend to hide in plain sight. Metal reaching down toward the water, insulating shells above the core, paths for charge to rise and fall on cue. He talks of coupling to the Earth's natural rhythms, not forcing new ones on it. The tower's height was not for antenna range alone. It set the timing for the charge-discharge cycle and let the top nodes sit inside the local electric field that always exists between ground and sky. Small details like this add up to a picture that feels less like invention and more like calibration. He tried versions of this before. In Colorado Springs, he noted that the right pulse made distant receivers answer. He wasn't sending radio in the way most think of it. He was trying to establish standing waves in a conductive sphere. His notebooks show intervals and delays, the way a drummer might measure the room by ear before the band begins. When the beat is true, the sound carries, not by shouting louder, but by letting the hall do the work. This is how he could make the claim, on some nights with straight face and steady tone, that enough input at Wardenclyffe would turn the entire planet into a usable conduit. Feed at the node of a standing wave and the energy returns on the crest. Do it cleanly and losses shrink. It sounds like fiction if you picture thunderbolts jumping oceans. It sounds less wild when you hold a vibrating string and feel the places along its length that barely move. He's trying to put his finger where the motion is calm and the power is highest. Walk with a crewman down the shaft under the tower. The air is damp and cool. He runs a hand along a clay wall that sweats a little, a sign the water table sits close. A pipe wicks beads that catch lamplight. He taps a copper line with a wrench and listens to the note. The men talk about wages and weather. They pass a coil wrapped in pitch and linen set aside to cure. This is where his big ideas meet soil and sweat. It grounds the work in more than theory. In the lab above, meters twitch as he shifts the rate. A lamp on a far table flares before the field even warms the air. He watches for delays and phase changes, small tells of how far the pulse travelled and how strong it came back. The geometry of the circuit matters less than the timing. His charts don't sing about destiny or grand secrets. They talk in lines and slopes that mean losses here and gains there. Still, there's an echo of something older in the way he trusts resonance more than force. Some whisper that he built Wardenclyffe where he did because the map of underground water looked like a diagram made in stone blocks far from Long Island. Others dismissed the link as an after-the-fact story. The record falls silent on motive. What survives is the physical rhyme. Water beneath, conductor inside, shell outside, all tuned for a specific beat. Whether it arose from study or instinct, the match is there to see. If you hold his design next to the outline of a massive stone structure raised on an aquifer, the pairing feels less strange. One uses copper and timber, the other granite and limestone. Both try to keep energy where it can build and release in rhythm. Both treat water not as a nuisance, but as a partner. The mineral content changes, the method of shaping changes, but the logic of resonance and grounding does not. That's the drift the story takes when you focus on what the hands did, not the legends built later. He repeats to his assistants that a tower network would let distant points pull usable power out of the ground standing waves, the way a well gives water even when the river is far away. That requires a deep ground and firm insulation. It also requires trust that the earth won't drown the signal in its own noise. The lab trials hint it won't if you tune your taps. He leans on that trust with a gambler's calm. One night, a sudden quiet follows a snap of discharge. For a breath, the room holds only a low ring felt more than heard. It fades in the bones before it fades in the air. He notes the timing with a dull pencil. Over time, those notes form the spine of a claim that his critics call overreach and his supporters call vision. It isn't proven at this scale, they point out. It isn't impossible, he counters, if the world is coaxed rather than kicked. The tower's wooden ribs creak in a wind that smells of rain. The ground below doesn't care. It holds its cool, dark current and waits for a pulse. Tesla stands at the edge and rests his fingers on the rail. He has seen bulbs bloom from soil and metal hiss with invisible pressure. He's mapped delays that stretch and shrink with conditions. He keeps testing because the line between too much loss and enough resonance feels thin and worth walking. No one in the yard that night talks about stone monuments across an ocean. Yet the parallels sit like tools on a bench. Metal into water, insulation around a core, frequencies chosen for how a large body answers. Supporters suggest he was rediscovering a logic older than his patents. Critics counter that likeness doesn't prove lineage. The debate for now is a soft murmur under the crackle. Let the frame widen. When you treat the planet as part of the circuit, rivers and water tables aren't background features. They're elements you can use, low-loss paths that carry waves farther than dry earth would allow. That's the shared secret in both designs. It isn't about the majesty above ground. It's about the cool, moving layer below. And under the stones of Giza, that layer flows in the same patient way the aquifer breathes beneath Long Island, suggesting the next turn in the story belongs to water. You lower yourself through a cut in chalky stone as the air cools against your cheeks. The flashlight beam paints pale arcs on damp limestone, and the smell is mineral and faintly metallic like wet coins. Your palm skims the wall, moisture beads on your skin. Somewhere ahead, beyond the range of the light, a low trickle knocks softly, as if a slow river were tapping its fingers inside the rock. It's not loud, it's patient. A worker ahead of you clears his throat and points the lamp into a cavity that wasn't on old maps. The floor dips into shadow. A rim of rock is slick underfoot. You listen. There it is again. The sound of moving water in a place that should be dry. A cold note rising and falling as if the plateau itself were breathing. Sand rubs under your boots, and a droplet falls with a bright tick, then another, marking time deeper than kings. Around you, the ceiling hardens into a natural vault cut by ages of flow. These passages aren't neat corridors. They're the irregular paths water takes when it finds a weakness and insists on a route. The air here is cooler than the desert above. It clings to the back of the throat. Your guide's hand rests on a block edge where dust has darkened. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. The stone is telling its own story. Now let the frame widen from this underground hush to another coast entirely. On Long Island, Tesla walked sandy ground that concealed a vast aquifer, water stored in layers of soil and porous rock that stretch far beyond any fence line. He liked this place not for the view of the bay, but for the ground beneath it. Water in the earth can carry a charge. It is the softened path electricity prefers. He built his tower there on purpose. Supporters suggest he viewed water-saturated soil as a kind of natural wire, not a thin copper thread, but a wide, forgiving channel that carries electrical waves through the crust with little fight. Wardenclyffe's deep ground connection wasn't just a rod in dirt. It was a handshake with an ocean under the island, a quiet pact that said, "Take this pulse and spread it." If that logic holds, the Giza Plateau's own aquifer forms the same invisible network under stone. Here under the pyramid, the slow movement of water does more than shine a flashlight beam. Flow sets tiny pressure changes in motion. Rock flexes by the width of a hair. Those microtremors line up with harmonics the planet loves to repeat. Long, low rhythms that circle the globe like a soft drumbeat. You can't hear them the way you hear a bell. You feel them as a nudge, a background sway. The stone listens, the stone answers. Engineers who walk these lower cavities talk about the ground as a living circuit. Limestone acts like insulation when it's dry and dense, breaking stray paths so a charge stays where a designer intends. Granite, seeded with quartz, behaves like a stubborn kind of conductor when it's pressed and shaken. The layers together look less like random geology and more like a nested device, an outer insulator, an inner core that can respond, and beneath it, all the wet plate of the earth itself. Hold a cable in your hand. The soft outer jacket protects the copper inside, keeping energy from wandering. Now translate that out of the toolbox and into the desert. The pyramid's limestone casing, once polished smooth, plays the jacket. Inside, the granite forms the core that interacts with stress and vibration. Below, the aquifer is a grounded plate, a sink that accepts charge and spreads it outward. It's not a perfect picture, but it explains why this shape might behave like a machine when the planet hums. People who study old foundations will tell you, you can fight your sight or you can work with it. Both the tower and the pyramid seem to choose the second path. They treat the earth as partner rather than obstacle. Instead of forcing energy down thin wires, they design for broad contact with soil and water, turning ground into a medium. Closed loops come into view. The planet offers a steady beat. The structure catches it, grows it, and sends it back. The loop tightens. The signal swells. Some whisper that every choice here looks deliberate. Water saturates the base. Conductive paths run into the wet layer. Insulating limestone keeps the charge from leaking sideways into dry air. A shape tuned to favour certain waves stands on top of it all. You could call that religious architecture, or you could call it engineering that respects the way electricity and vibration travel through stone and groundwater. The label matters less than the pattern. Run a finger along a seam where block meets bedrock. The fit is close. That closeness keeps air pockets small and keeps contact with the ground broad. In electrical terms, that's coupling, two systems matched so energy moves between them with little loss. A carpenter with a bad fit loses heat through cracks around a door. A builder with a bad fit loses charge into random gaps and spills. These joints suggest a different aim. Grip the earth well. Do not waste the beat. Now bring Tesla back into view. He thought the planet stored energy and could be made to ring. Send the right kind of pulse down into it, and the earth returns it stronger. Not because of magic, but because all big structures have natural modes that love to be fed. His tower was a sender and a listener. It would sip the faint rhythms underfoot, add power from a coil that hissed and glowed, and drive that rhythm back into the same medium, a loop, not a one-way broadcast. Others dismiss the idea as romantic, arguing the ground is too messy and unpredictable for clean transmission. Yet you stand above a plateau that hides channels like veins and cavities like lungs, and the sound of water never quite goes away. Messy doesn't mean useless. It means designers needed to observe, adjust and tune with care. That too is a kind of precision, one that values placement and material over complex moving parts. An electrical engineer tracking the pieces would sketch a simple block diagram in the dust. Source: earth vibrations and water flow. Conditioner: architectural geometry that favours certain frequencies. Converter: granite that responds when pressed and shaken, ready to shift motion into charge. Transmission path: aquifer-coupled ground that can carry the wave across long distances. Insulation: limestone that keeps energy from bleeding into hot desert air. It looks suspiciously like a transmission device that uses the planet as cable. A man from the survey team kneels and touches the floor where dampness darkens the stone. He presses his ear close and smiles out of habit. He can't hear electricity, of course. He's listening for a hint of the tiny knocks, a little percussion that means water is moving against rock somewhere below. He marks a line with his pencil. On the surface, those lines form paths that tend to follow old fault traces and long, straight features that point toward the river. Energy likes paths too. Supporters suggest the old builders set their structure on one of these paths on purpose, not because it was easier to quarry stone there, but because the ground beneath would amplify the slow waves that flow through everything, like a drum skin stretched just so. When the flood pulses of the Nile drained back toward the sea, the level under the plateau rose and fell. More flow, more microtremor. The machine would have had seasons. On Long Island, Tesla tested a simpler version of that swing. He watched the tide and noted changes in ground resistance. Wet ground lowered the barriers, dry ground raised them. The Earth's mood shifts with water. Two sites, both flirting with that truth. One with a steel lattice catching lightning in the air. One with stone ribs catching a quieter tone inside the rock. Different ages, same playbook. A common question sits at the edge of this scene. If both systems leaned on water, vibration, and broad contact with the crust, why do we treat one as myth and the other as science? It may come down to what's left standing. Wardenclyffe fell, leaving concrete stumps and a photograph. The pyramid remains, though stripped of casing and stripped of whatever active devices might have once lived in its throat. We judge by survivors, not by intent. Walk along this low corridor and trace the pattern with your hand. Moisture gives way to chalk-dry patches, then returns. It maps a slow heartbeat. Stone holds memory in the way it stains, in the way salt gathers and then dissolves. If this ground carried charge, that story might be written in places we haven't looked yet, in thin chemical layers, in subtle cracking that follows old paths, in tiny shifts in magnetism trapped when mineral grains froze in place. The test list grows with each drip you hear. Critics counter that aquifers under famous sites prove nothing. Water under rock is common, true, yet builders choose, and choices leave fingerprints. When structures cluster along fault lines, over springs, or near seasonal flood fans, it invites questions about function. At the very least, it shows attention to ground that goes beyond a flat spot and a view. You can feel that attention under your fingers. It's the difference between chance and craft. Consider the way a boatman reads a river by the texture of the surface. He doesn't see the current, he sees its signature. Engineers read land the same way. Subtle damp makes a darker patch. A hairline shift in slope changes how grit pools. Here, the old signatures point to water as a constant partner. They also suggest someone kept the structure threaded to that partner with metal lines, buried deep enough to reach the wet layer. Metal marries stone to water in a clean way. A thin breeze slips through this cavity, cooler than the air you left above. It carries a scent like rain in dust. Your guide taps the wall twice. Time to move. We climb, but the mind stays below for a beat, tracing currents that never meet the sunlight. If these currents once carried energy, they would not have cared about processions or prayers. They would have followed the easiest path. Builders who felt that truth might have shaped their entire design to honour it. The way forward links both worlds, ward and desert, into one map with different symbols. On one side, coils and copper plates sliding into wet sand. On the other, granite lintels and limestone jackets hugging a mass of stone that rests on a saturated base. Each tries to couple to the planet, to make a clean contact without waste. The question isn't whether contact was made, it's how far the wave travelled once it left the cradle. You step back into warmer air and the faint grit of wind-blown dust. Night is a soft cloak up here, and the stars look close enough to pinch between two fingers. Under your feet, the old trickle continues unseen but steady. Tesla thought the Earth could feed a tower, and the tower could feed the Earth in return. A loop in the dark. If that loop ever closed under Giza, its trace may still run under these stones, waiting for ears tuned to water, motion, and the hidden currents that tie both machines to the same quiet source. Midnight in the Grand Gallery. The air is cool against your cheeks, a faint mineral tang riding each breath. Your hand finds the wall and comes away dusty, the stone dry as bone. The corridor rises ahead like a narrow canyon, the floor sloping upward, the sides stepping inward in layered shelves. Above, the ceiling folds toward a line of darkness, each corbel like a rib in a long chest. You speak a single soft word to test the room. It comes back to you thicker than you sent it, as if the stone caught your voice and decided to keep a portion for itself. You press 2 fingers to your neck to steady the pulse and call out again, longer this time. The note swells, then hangs in a low afterring that seems to perch along the ledges. Your ears try to fix a source and fail. The sound spreads in the narrowing width, then tightens as you climb. It feels less like a hallway and more like standing inside a shaped instrument, where space itself selects what it wants to keep alive. A guide once joked that the gallery sings. He lowered his voice when it kept singing after he stopped. Over the past few decades, engineers have walked in with careful microphones and data loggers. They recorded tones that grow stronger as they move up the slope. The stepped ceiling and tapering height don't behave like simple masonry. They heard vibration toward a band that clusters near A at 440 cycles per second. It's not perfect, not a tuning fork, but for a stone corridor it acts unnaturally tidy. Dull claps become bright. Footfalls smear into a soft chord. The geometry participates. There's a practical question that won't sit quietly. Why would a burial complex need this kind of acoustic punch? Mortuary spaces in Egypt thrived on paint, prayers, and symbolic scenes, not engineered reverb. Chanting, when used, did not demand a corridor that shapes and strengthens specific notes. Others dismiss this line as romantic speculation, of course. Yet when you stand here at this hour and hear how sound grows, the old explanation feels thin, like a label stuck over a control panel whose switches still click. Supporters suggest the ledges lining both sides once carried elements that fed the room's voice. Not decoration, resonators. Wooden beams or stone rails fit into slots we can still see. Set at intervals, each tuned to a different harmonic. They would have turned the gallery into a giant acoustic ladder, each rung stepping energy higher. No surviving pieces have been found, and critics counter that absence weakens the case. But the architecture leaves hints, repeated notches, consistent shelf widths, an industrial neatness that invites more than foot traffic. Modern machines lean on shapes like these. Combustion chambers carve stepped throats to build pressure nodes where waves stack. Acoustic filters funnel noisy ranges into stable bands. Energy amplifiers in metal or ceramic use narrowing passages to trap standing waves, turning chaotic buzz into orderly power. Look at the gallery again with that mindset. Each corbel shelf meets the next in a measured offset. Each change in width nudges a wavelength toward a favoured home. It's a stone version of a device engineers draw with rulers and patience. Down below, another ingredient waits in the darker rooms. If the Queen's chamber brewed a light, quick gas, and some whisper it did, hydrogen slipping from reactions in stone shafts, then this corridor becomes more than a music hall. Hydrogen responds to sound. Push it with pressure waves and the gas ionizes more easily. Ionized gas carries charge, and charge loves a path. Up here, those paths trend toward granite overhead, where quartz waits in great mass. The air itself becomes a medium, not just a passenger. The gallery behaves like an escalator for vibration. At the bottom, many frequencies enter, raw and unruly, like a crowd in a station. As the space narrows and the stepped roof pinches, the crowd thins into a few lanes. The chaotic becomes selective. By the time the sound reaches the top opening, it favours tight bands near that familiar pitch. Think of it as conditioning, preparing waves for work, not worship. This is where the corridor stops being architecture and starts acting like a tuned component. Your palm settles on a corbel, feeling the faint grit. The stone is cool, but you sense a history of warmth in this room. People have reported unusual marks high along the ceiling, dark streaks that don't match the usual soot from torches. Some align with ledge positions, as if something once sat there and ran hot. No firm proof locks that down, and others dismiss the marks as later contamination. But when the gallery speaks back at midnight, the idea that it once did more than echo is hard to shake. Across oceans, old stories linger of structures that sing. In Scotland, tales describe forts whose walls were heat-fused by forces that roared like a furnace. In the Andes, certain stone plazas hold a tone when you clap, a fast ring that feels engineered. Mesopotamian myths speak of temples that gave voice to the wind. These are not measurements, they are laces of lore, yet they sketch a faint global echo that resonates with what your ears meet here. The thought is simple and unsettling. Ancient builders might have built for sound as a tool. The gallery slope adds another trick. Gravity drags heavy gases down, but vibration can herd them up. If hydrogen flowed from the lower chamber, a rising wave train could have pushed the light gas along, a conveyor made of pressure rather than belt. In that model, the Grand Gallery isn't a hallway you walk through. It's a throat. It breathes in energy, takes in a wide spectrum and exhales a chosen tone toward the granite zones that wait above, where piezoelectric crystals could turn shove into spark. There's a human scene that lingers behind all this. A caretaker in a faded jacket lets the tour group pass and pauses alone, listening for a flaw in the quiet. He hums under his breath, hesitant, off-key at first, then finds a note that the room likes. It swells around him, a soft wall of sound. He doesn't know the theories and doesn't need to. He knows the place answers. He closes his eyes and hums again, higher this time. The gallery answers again. It feels like cooperation. Measurements, of course, don't sing. They log decay times and frequency peaks. Engineers publish charts where lines rise and fall, and here those lines lean toward that same tonal neighbourhood reported upstairs. The stepped ceiling catches reflections and stacks them. The taper compresses the field. The ledges, if fitted with something resonant, would have turned reflection into reinforcement. You could stand in the lower half and feed small energy. You would move up and get a larger response. Critics counter that this reads too much into acoustics that any large stone space might produce. A cavern booms, a cathedral rings. Why should this corridor be special? The answer may rest in the consistency. The gallery treats sound like a system does, not like a room. The way it narrows, the way the shelves repeat, the way the pitch settles, these feel intentional. They turn unpredictable echo into drafted behaviour. And there is the missing piece. Architecture can guide energy, but it cannot start it on its own. Something had to drive those waves, a mechanical source, flow through a valve, a chemical process that thumped like an engine. Supporters suggest tuned beams could have taken a modest input and multiplied it, but even those need a starter pulse. If the gas theory holds, perhaps a pressure oscillation began below and climbed. Perhaps human voices sparked the dance during calibration, then machinery took over. Consider how that would sound. A low throb pulling through the corridor, too steady to be footsteps, too smooth to be wind. The note meeting another, beating against it until they lock. Ledged shelves humming like a line of small drums. You'd feel it in your teeth. You'd watch dust tremble from a seam and lift, as if gravity lost its hold for a breath. The room would cease to be a room, it would become a conduit. Not far from where you stand, two small openings lead toward the core. Their size and angle match patterns you've seen in drawn plans of waveguides. If the gallery conducted and conditioned, those routes could have carried the result into granite spaces designed to take a shove and return it as charge. In that view, the Grand Gallery is the middle of the machine, a processor between chemical origin and crystalline conversion. Some whisper that the same tuning repeats across the monument, a harmony written in stone. They point to dimensions that echo musical ratios and to chambers that prefer specific notes. Others dismiss this as numerology. It's fair to be careful, but in the hush of this hour, your ear is the judge in front of you. The place makes choices about sound. It selects, it strengthens, it aligns, in ways that keep engineers interested long after they leave with dust on their cuffs. You reach the upper end, where the space suddenly tightens and the air feels drier. The after-ring thins. The voice of the gallery condenses into a narrow breath that seems to aim forward, not back. If you step through, you enter the domain of granite and weight. If you drop down, you return to limestone and damp. Between them, this throat has taught sound how to behave. It has given it a job. The odd thing is how calm it feels. No sense of chapel or pageantry, no story of kings, just stone arranged to do a task it still remembers. If the past ran a current here, you can almost hear the residue, a faint line of tone written on the walls like a watermark. And if that current needed fuel, we'll have to leave the singing corridor and follow the cold trace downward to the chamber where chemistry waits in the stone. Fluorescent lights buzz softly overhead. A lab coat sleeve brushes a granite slab, cool and grainy under the fingertips. A handheld probe hums as it touches down, vibration travelling through the stone like a small steady tremor. On the bench, 2 digital meters wake. The numbers climb. A faint smell of warm dust and solder hangs in the air as the granite pushes out a measurable voltage, as if a tiny battery had been sitting inside the rock all along waiting for someone to press the right button. This isn't magic, it's piezoelectricity, a mouthful that means pressure electricity. Some minerals carry a crystal lattice that flips charge when squeezed or shaken. Quartz is the classic example. Press on it, and one face takes on a positive charge while the opposite side turns negative. Release the stress and the charge fades. Everyday tools rely on this quiet trick. A quartz watch keeps time because a thin sliver vibrates at a precise rate. A barbecue lighter makes a spark by striking a crystal and forcing it to cough up a shock. Sensors in cameras, printers and microphones use the same effect, turning motion into signal. Simple, repeatable, measurable. Now let the room grow darker and the air cooler. You stand beneath piled blocks that travelled from far upriver. Aswan granite laid into a chamber where sound lingers and footsteps land with a soft, odd lift. The walls and ceiling above were cut from stone dense with quartz. Many sources describe that granite as heavy in silicon dioxide. Some accounts even place the quartz content astonishingly high. Whether 85% or not, the point holds. This chamber is wrapped in crystal-rich material that responds to pressure and vibration with charge. Not for decoration, supporters suggest, but because the stone itself is active when it moves. If sound swells through a space like this, the stress doesn't remain poetic. It becomes a physical pressure wave, tiny pushes and pulls running through each block. In the grand gallery below, the narrow rising corridor behaves like an acoustic funnel. Engineers who study sound see stepped walls and a taper that can capture and strengthen specific notes. Push those tones up and into the granite ceiling beams above, and you aren't just shaking stone, you're working a field of quartz crystals at once. A single grill lighter makes a spark you can see. Hundreds of tons of vibrating crystal might make a field you can feel. Supporters suggest a more curious layer. When many oscillators move together at the same beat, their output adds rather than cancels. Radios use this principle, so do concert halls. The term from wave physics is constructive interference. Each crystal's tiny charge aligns with its neighbour when the phase, the timing of the vibration, matches. Add a million whispers and you get a shout. In a block of granite, you're not dealing with one tidy crystal but a chaotic crowd. Yet when the stress repeats at a steady rate, patches of order emerge. In those zones, charge can sum and strengthen. The stone becomes a coordinated choir, not a random mutter. The geometry matters. Edges reflect waves. Flat faces launch them. Corners trap nodes where motion is small but stress is high. The chamber's smooth planes, right angles, and tight joints create standing patterns, like ripples fixed in place on a drum skin. If the internal dimensions and the density of granite line up with a favoured note, motion across the block can sink. Think of rooms where certain notes bloom, the ones that make shelves buzz and windows quiver. Now scale it to 100-ton beams, set into a box of crystal and limestone, each surface guiding the pulse, each seam acting like a ruler for waves. Those waves do more than stir charge. Granite under pressure also behaves in odd electrical ways. When a mechanical pulse compresses a crystal-laced rock, electrons don't just sit politely, they can shift, slip, and in some cases help ionize gas. Ionization means breaking apart neutral atoms so electrons roam freely. Fluorescent lights use a similar process inside glass tubes. Fusion research plays with it at extreme scales. In a sealed stone room filled with a simple gas, a repeated push can raise the chance that atoms become carriers of current rather than obstacles. Pressure turns to plasma-like conditions. Air becomes a better partner for electricity. That leads to the chamber below. The smaller room cut from softer limestone sits lower in the body of the structure, with narrow passages that angle upward. Reports from robotic probes once described residues that looked like chemical leftovers in those cramped shafts, compounds linked to hydrogen production in reaction textbooks. Critics counter that contamination might explain some of it. Others dismiss the match as stretching. Either way, the engineering logic is plain. If hydrogen gas entered the upper parts of the structure, even in modest amounts, a vibrating field of quartz above could have given those light atoms a boost. Ionized hydrogen moves readily. It carries charge without much resistance. That combination, piezoelectric surfaces and a simple mobile gas, creates conditions where energy transfer improves instead of leaking away as heat and noise. Leakage is the quiet killer of any high-voltage plan. Here, the shell of the monument once wore a jacket of fine white limestone. It was smooth and carefully set. Electrical engineers know that the right insulator keeps energy where it needs to be. Accounts note that this casing limestone differed from the local bedrock, with chemistry that made it a better barrier. Think of it as a ceramic sheath on a long cable. It reduces bleed-off into the surrounding air and guides charge toward a target. The inner granite acts like a core that can hold and move electrical potential. The outer layer narrows the path and keeps the field from wandering. On another shore, years and lifetimes away, a tower rose with a heavy copper root reaching into wet ground. Not an accident. Water in the earth behaves as a pathway for electrical waves, and insulation lies between the active parts and the world outside. Methods from that project show the same instincts. Deep coupling to the ground, careful use of materials that block or carry charge, and a hunt for resonance, the frequency where a small push creates a large effect. Back inside the stone chambers, the question becomes rhythm. What tone sets the crystals to work together, not at odds? When a room naturally prefers a certain note, even a faint input can bloom into a stronger motion. The grand gallery's shape appears built for harvesting a broad band of sound and refining it as it climbs, the way a horn gathers a voice and sends it forward. The moment those pulses reach the beams above, the stress pulls on quartz in the same way the lab probe did, only this time the probe is a corridor tuned to boost specific beats. The meters in our mental lab would flicker here too, if wired to safe terminals. Charge that builds needs a path. A path needs a reason to exist. If gas from below occupied the upper passages, the field created by vibrating crystal would meet a medium ready to carry it. Ionization smooths that meeting. The field gets stronger where the geometry focuses waves. Ionized gas reduces the friction. The two together could support a flow, perhaps cyclical, perhaps pulsed. Supporters suggest the structure acted like a giant transducer, transforming motion into potential. potential into motion, in a loop locked to the stone's dimensions. Critics find the chain too long and the evidence too thin. The debate lives in the gap between measurable lab behaviour and an ancient space we can't operate as intended. Still, the pieces line up cleanly enough to keep the conversation going. Quartz under stress yields charge. Granite holds a lot of quartz. Acoustic resonance shapes stress in predictable, buildable ways. Ionized gas favours current. An insulating jacket holds the field. A ground plane underfoot gives the charge somewhere to go. Together they resemble the bones of a device. They also echo decisions in modern systems built for very different eras. That rhyme is hard to ignore when you lay drawings side by side. In the lab, the researcher adjusts a dial. The probe's buzz shifts a little higher. On the screen, the voltage spikes, then steadies. Another hand notes the number in the margin with a dull pencil. The data is not a myth. The effect is real and old, like fire. Simple physics that sits ready for anyone willing to apply pressure at the right tempo. Scale remains the bridge we can't cross inside these sealed rooms, not safely, and not without changing what we hope to study. So we look for indirect signs, cracked beams that recorded stress, patterns that hint at standing waves, residue where gas might have gathered, and the quiet logic of insulation and grounding laid into limestone and bedrock. Some whisper that the stone doesn't just respond, it sings back, training any input into the room's preferred rhythm until the whole mass moves. If so, the phrase activation energy takes on a practical meaning. You need a starter. Vibrations, pressure waves, maybe a set of tuned sources in the gallery, something to prime the crystal field. Once the system catches, it would ride its own groove. Pull the starter away, and the effect would fade. You can't squeeze a crystal without squeezing something else. For a little while, the structure becomes an instrument that plays itself. We can test parts of this in the present. Engineers have already shown how stone shapes can concentrate radio waves. That sits in the same family of behaviours. Push a wave at the right shape and it bends, clusters, and grows stronger in chosen spots. Step back from radio to sound and from sound to stress, and the theme repeats. The pyramid's proportions are not random numbers. The chamber sizes are not casual. Every surface teaches a wave where to stand and where to kneel. Where hydrogen comes in, the stakes rise. The gas is simple, fast, and reactive. When a piezoelectric field reaches into a hydrogen-rich pocket, ionization blooms easily. Under the wrong conditions, it can also ignite. The same traits that make it a fine carrier can turn it dangerous when a pressure wave overwhelms the safe range. That double edge fits the scars found higher up. It also fits the caution in anyone who hesitates to treat these spaces as a working lab. You don't test a match factory with a blowtorch, so we return to the bench, to the meter and the hum. The world in the stone doesn't care about myth. It obeys a lattice and a push. Put enough crystals together, press them with the right beat, give their charge a path and a reason, and the effect grows. That is the starting point, not the grand claim. If there was a machine here, it needed a trigger, it needed rhythm, it needed a medium that would carry the charge away. The fingerprints of those needs seem etched into the walls. Crystal-rich rock overhead, an amplifying corridor below, a possible source of hydrogen, and an insulating skin to keep the field from bleeding into desert air. The scene holds steady. The light stays even. No grand reveal, just the narrowing of odds. You run a hand along a granite edge in your mind and feel a fine grit under the skin. The residue of a million tiny crystals pointing, waiting, almost in step. The question that follows is quiet and practical. If a room of stone can learn a note and turn stress into electricity, what exactly taught it to sing? Midnight makes the corridor feel colder. Your palm meets damp limestone, chilled and slick, as mineral moisture beads and runs like sweat down the wall. The air tastes faintly sharp, a clean sting at the back of your throat that doesn't fit a sealed chamber. Your breath fogs in the beam of a small flashlight. Every sound seems padded, footsteps softened by dust, a faint drip from somewhere above, the muffled thud of your heartbeat when the passage narrows and the ceiling presses low. You step into the Queen's chamber and stop. The room is smaller than its famous neighbour, the walls pale and soft under the light, the floor not quite level. Limestone, not granite. The stone gives slightly under fingertips, a chalky grit left on skin. 2 small shafts pierce the masonry, each opening barely the size of a hand, climbing away at steep angles into the dark. They look less like vents and more like pipes, the mouth smoothed by tools, edges too neat to be accident. The ceiling rises into a shallow gable, the apex clean, the planes symmetrical. It reads as a workspace, not a shrine, not a royal bedroom of the dead, but a place built to handle flow, of air, of vapour, of something that needs careful direction. A field notebook rests on your knee as you kneel by the southern shaft. The graphite leaves a faint shine on the page. The shaft's throat smells different, dry, but with a chemical tang you can't name. You run a finger along the lip and feel a crust of salts, rough like sugar on stone. Supporters suggest this chamber was a component, not a destination. Others dismiss that as speculation. Yet the materials ask particular questions. Why limestone here, when the power of granite lies just above? Why narrow ducts cut with such care, if no one would ever crawl through them, or carve prayers along their length? In the 1990s, small-tracked robots nosed into these shafts, machines no bigger than a toy car with thin camera tethers, because a person could not fit. Their wheels chirped on the stone. Lights washed over square blocks set as doors deep inside, copper pinheads gleaming in the beam. The cameras also saw residue where no human hand had touched for millennia. Reports describe traces of hydrochloric acid in the northern run, hydrated zinc chloride in the southern, and ammonium compounds streaking the surfaces deeper in. These are not cemetery smells, they are the footprint of reactions. You thumb the page and sketch a simple chain, acid in one corridor, zinc salt in the other, an ammonium source to moderate or trigger. When hydrochloric acid meets zinc chloride in solution, hydrogen gas boils off. It's a clean, strong reaction. In a lab, you'd control it in a glass flask, a rubber hose puffing a steady stream of invisible gas toward a burner. In a stone chamber, scale changes everything. Porous limestone can wick liquid slowly, letting acid seep and pool along edges. Channels cut at angles can separate inputs until a gate opens and flow combines at a chosen rate. The shafts rise like chimneys, but they can also serve as supply lines, each carrying a different reagent to a mixing zone placed where geometry funnels upward. You stand and look at the ceiling again. That shallow gable isn't decoration. It helps collect and move like gases. Hydrogen is the lightest atom. It climbs, it slips through pores, through hairline joints, faster than you want to believe. If produced here, even a gentle current would drift toward the highest point, then explore every available path. The short horizontal passage that leads from this chamber toward the grand gallery touches granite. Not much, but enough. That stone, rich in quartz, responds to pressure and vibration by moving charge across its internal lattice. If hydrogen fills the voids and lanes, then acoustic energy from above could turn that gas into a well-behaved medium, a kind of glide path for electrical effects. A chemical engineer you spoke to once rubbed his thumb and forefinger together while he explained it, making the tiny squeak that glass makes when cleaned. Hydrogen likes to escape, he said, but limestone slows it down. Give it direction and a reason to move, heat, vibration, pressure, and it will flow where you want it to go. That's the task of design, not magic, not myth. Pathways, timing, containment. Critics counter that residues can come from modern contamination. Sweat, dust, oils from hands or compounds tracked in by tools. A fair caution. but these deposits sit beyond the points where people could reach before the robots went in. They coat surfaces behind occluding blocks, in narrow segments where you'd need to snake an arm for several meters and still not touch the spots the lenses showed. Others dismiss the readings as misinterpretation of basic salts. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. Acid in one line, zinc salt in another, ammonium signatures smeared along a third path. It is the arrangement that draws attention. A small hiss comes from the old ventilation port and your shoulders stiffen before you place it. The outside breeze grabbing at a crack, a trick of pressure. But it fits the picture you're building. Hydrogen in a closed space moves silently. It carries heat poorly. It carries sound well. In the presence of an electric field, it ionizes with ease. The smallest nudge lifts an electron. Those ions make gas behave differently, more responsive to oscillations, more ready to conduct. In a room lined with quartz-rich blocks that respond to vibration by spitting charge, an ionized gas becomes a partner rather than a passenger. Supporters suggest the shafts served as controlled inlets and outlets. The northern one, laced with acid, might have delivered HCl vapor or solution to a mixing zone. The southern, bearing zinc chloride residue, could have dripped brine onto a pad of crushed zinc or other media and sent vapor back in return. Ammonium compounds, sticky, persistent, may have moderated the reaction, altering pH or collecting as salts after gas production surged. In a modern plant, you'd use valves and gauges. Here, the stone itself might be the control, with porosity, angle, and capillary pull doing the quiet work of timing. You run the light across the ceiling again and allow your ears to trace the room. No decorations cut into the walls, no table for offerings, no place for a sarcophagus. The architectural language points away from funerary use. Instead, surfaces are simple and washable. Shafts are tidy. The gable roof keeps condensation from falling back into a reaction mix. The small chamber reads as a reactor vessel, or at least the mixing hall before the main event. Hydrogen carries two faces, power and risk. In controlled flows, it is a clean energy carrier, burning to water and nothing more. In a confined volume with the right ratio of gas to air, it is a quiet threat. One errant spark, and flame races faster than sight, preferring ceilings and edges. Here, add another layer. The upper rooms of this monument can sing, acoustically at 440 Hz, and those vibrations steep whatever fills the channels. If hydrogen fills the throat between chambers and granite above vibrates under acoustic load, parts of that gas will ionize even before ignition. That's fine if you're trying to transmit energy. It's dangerous if control slips. You angle the light toward the northern shaft mouth and watch a faint wavy sheen in the damp film. The room feels slightly warmer near the opening, as if air from deeper stone carries a different temperature. Limestone breathes, it absorbs moisture and gives it back. That could tame humidity swings, keep a reaction steady, spread heat slowly rather than in hot spikes. A good choice if you want a stable generator. The robot footage from decades ago lingers in the mind. Little wheels bouncing, a thin cable twitching when the track caught, tiny scratches on ancient plaster, then the lens meeting a flat stone studded with two copper dots. A door, but a peculiar one. Metal in limestone, placed deep beyond reach. If these were structural, they were unusual choices. If they were part of a mechanism, they were right where you'd put an electrode or sensor for a slow chemical gate. There is another note in the reports. Sulfuric acid signatures and ammonium chloride in the mix. Add those to zinc and acid flows, and you have a stew that can spike heat if anything accelerates the reaction. Hydrogen produces cleanly until it doesn't. If two streams met too quickly, or if a block shifted and dumped a pool into a dry pocket, the gas surge would be severe. In a sealed geometry with angled ceilings, pressure climbs and looks for the quickest way out. Upward. Always upward. The horizontal passage out of this room is shaped like a low slot, not comfortable for walkers, perfect for flow. It bends, rises and meets the base of the long gallery. The stones along that throat include granite elements that can pick up charge as they flex. Under steady vibration from above, electrons gather. With hydrogen in the void, ions flicker and settle. The system starts to look like a staged engine. Chemical feed here, acoustic compression there, electrical translation in the heavy chamber at the top. Pieces align like teeth on a gear. Some whisper that none of this points to energy at all, that the acids preserve something organic or clean something sacred. Yet such work leaves its own fingerprints. Deposits of resins, soot, pigments, or repetitive tool marks on beaded edges. What we see here are clean planes, flow-friendly corners, chemical films where only a machine could crawl. If ritual belonged here, it wore a lab coat, not a priest's crown. Stand still and listen. The chamber breathes so gently that you might miss it. A draft brushes your cheek, barely there. The flashlight warms in your hand. You think about modern hydrogen rigs, steel canisters, gauges, fume hoods, and then about this soft stone room doing the same job with gravity, porosity, and angled shafts. The economy of it is quiet and unnerving. Use the rock as the vessel. Use the slope as the pump. Use the air as the mover. If this was the start, then the gallery above was the throat that sang, and the granite chamber beyond was the heart that squeezed charge out of crystal. A full chain. Chemical to acoustic to electric. A machine that begins not with wires, but with a sour smell and a wet wall. It's one thing to posit grandeur upstairs where tourists stand in awe beneath cracked beams. It's another to feel the grit of chloride on your fingertip in a room that never pretended to be holy. Of course, every system prefers balance. Add too much acid and it runs hot. Drop the flow and the reaction starves. Shift a block and the careful timing of drip, wick, and drift loses sync. The shaft doors could have acted as dampers. Copper studs might have taken a small potential to open or close a porous gate. But stone moves. Seasons nudge. A tremor far away can shake a tight fit loose. Then pressure builds where it shouldn't. Hydrogen collects with just enough oxygen in the corners where tools never reached. What follows in such a case does not roar like a furnace. Hydrogen can burn almost invisibly. It flashes. It leaves marks high up, where the hottest, thinnest tongue of flame licks and passes. It leaves salt-white films where water vapour cools on limestone and crystallises out its load. It cracks granite under sudden load because the blow lands faster than the stone can flex. Scars tell direction and speed. You cap your pencil and rest your palm on the wall one more time. The moisture has crept back over the spot you brushed dry minutes ago. This room tends itself. It soaks, it wicks, it steadies. If the builders wanted a gentle, constant feed, limestone gives them that. If they wanted a stable staging ground for a light, slippery gas, this is where they would start. Climb out and you can follow the path in your head. Up the slot along the long ribs of the gallery, into the heavy box of the chamber where the air tastes metallic. You can almost hear the missing note beneath the stone, a tone that once shaped everything above it. And if, one night, the flow ran wild, if the mixture met in a rush or a shock from the heavens tickled the gas into chaos, the quiet workbench downstairs would have been the first place to show it. The Queen's chamber feels like a whispering engine that never cleared its throat. The evidence sits in streaks and films and a handful of robot frames. The risk sits in hydrogen's narrow comfort zone. Ahead, the corridor rises where heat and pressure would have run, where a voice of stone might have turned gas to light. The trail leads upward, and the marks it left behind are waiting in the dark. Midnight air holds a dusty chill as a lone structural engineer steadies a flashlight in the grand gallery. The beam climbs the corbelled stone and stops on a black streak, then another, then a row of them. Long, dark ribbons across the ceiling. They sit too high for torchbearers and run too straight for wandering smoke. The smell in here is dry, mineral, faintly metallic. You can feel the cool bite of the stone through your palm, and somewhere in that coolness there's a memory of heat. He steps along the sloping floor. The light sweeps in quiet arcs. Each band of char lies exactly where air would pause before it turned upward. Supporters suggest these are not stains from visits, but the signature of a rapid burn that left marks in predictable lanes. Critics counter that soot can travel, eddies twist, and time distorts patterns. Yet the linework is machine neat, the spacing repetitive, like notes placed on a staff. It reads less like vandalism and more like a thermal map printed in carbon. This is where the evidence shifts from odd to methodical. The dark streaks collect in the gallery's upper zone, where lighter gases would gather. Hydrogen is buoyant. In a still corridor, it would rise until the roof meets the plume. The bands align with that ceiling track, not scattered, not smeared, aligned. Some whisper that an ignition event raced through these little bays, burning swift and leaving these tracks as it rolled toward the shaft that climbs to the chamber above. The light catches flecks in the burns, gritty and pale, as if something once bubbled and dried along the path of the heat. He moves upward. The air grows tighter, as if the space were holding its breath. At the top, a small opening leads toward the king's chamber. The flashlight flickers across granite that drinks the light, then gleams back in flecks. Those beams above, those massive granite slabs, hold a different kind of story. A thin fracture runs clean from one end to the other. Another beam shows a bow, a slight outward swell that only reveals itself when the beam cuts past it and the line won't stay true. You can slide a fingertip into some of the cracks. They feel sharp, not worn. They feel young. The walls themselves tell it plainly. Granite blocks have shifted outward by more than a finger's width. One seam opens, meets dust, then closes again a few stones later. That does not look like slow settling. It looks like sudden pressure. You can set a hand on the stone and sense the stubborn solidity, but the geometry has changed. If this were earthquakes, the pattern would be messy, shared, more democratic in its damage. Yet the descending passage is quiet. The subterranean chamber holds its old chill, its floors unbuckled, its ceiling smooth. The violence seems choosy. He angles the beam into the southern shaft. Where light meets the stone, layers of pale crust stack like frost grown thick and old. An inch at places. Your nail scratches it and comes away salty. That's not torch residue. That's chemistry. In a confined run, water vapour driven to high temperatures can leave this kind of crust, when pressure kicks it across stone and the vapour finds minerals ready to crystallise. In a place where hydrogen could ignite, quickly, quietly, the smoulder might not show as open flame, but the heat would leave behind a ledger. Hydrogen fire is tricky. It burns with a near-invisible flame and races fast in narrow corridors. In ductwork, it can create pressure waves that feel like a solid thing punching through air. Here, with granite and limestone holding firm, a shock would take the path of least resistance and travel upward, compressing as it went. That upward path matches the blackened lanes in the grand gallery and the cracks that bloom in the beams above. The engineering lesson is simple. Shape guides force. This shape funnels it like a trumpet flips a breath into a shout. The timeline is the oddest part. Tomb robbers take their time. They carry, pry, search, scrape. Damage from thieves looks like missing doors, broken lids, chisel marks, and scattered goods. What you see here records minutes, maybe seconds. A detonation doesn't negotiate. It arrives, leaves its heat and pressure, and a chamber's geometry never returns to its first state. If anything was taken later, it came after the moment that made these cracks. In the grand gallery, he rests the flashlight on a ledge and frees his hands. Stone dust coats his fingers. The ledges run in long stepped lines on both walls. Some whisper these could have supported resonant frames, the way an organ carries pipes. If that was ever true, then those dark bands on the ceiling trace where rising gases met a hot ceiling and kept going. The scorch tracks sit above the ledges like notes above a staff. almost taunting in their order. Heat loves order when the space imposes it. The power plant failure theory is a careful one, and it moves in stages. It treats the lower chamber as a chemical engine, the gallery as an amplifier, and the upper chamber as the part that turns motion into charge. In that reading, the failure would be a runtime event, not sabotage, not squatting torches, but a system pushed beyond limits by external stress or a misstep in control. The idea has allies and detractors. Others dismiss it as clever storytelling in search of physics. Yet the damage keeps pointing back to a single instant rather than years of wear. What could start a chain like this? Supporters suggest an out-of-band disturbance, a pulse from the Earth that shoved the system harder than usual. A miscalculated mix in the lower chamber could have tipped the hydrogen from transport medium to fuel. In a confined, tuned corridor, a spark of ionization or even sufficient acoustic pressure can set it off. Flames need oxygen, yes, but recombination and partial burns in mixed gases can make heat without the classic yellow flare. What matters here is the energy, not the colour of the flame. There's a practical measure to all this. Stand under those cracked beams and think about the force required to flex granite, to move walls outward. That much pressure isn't a slow creep, it arrives like a blow, and if earthquakes did it, then why do nearby spaces not share the same wound? The subterranean chamber, with its low ceiling and raw bedrock floor, should show echoes of the same violence. It doesn't. The story repeats in just a few rooms, connected by the paths that gas would take. Down in the shaft, the salt tells time. Thick crust does not lay down in a single day. But a single event can flash minerals into solution and then let them grow back out as the moisture fades. He chips a flake between finger and thumb. It crumbles like old plaster, dry and slightly bitter on the tongue. It is stubbornly ordinary, which is what makes it valuable. Ordinary materials carry extraordinary stories when the context is right. Follow the flow, start in the Queen's chamber with reactive compounds. Pressure pushes gas into the gallery. Vibrations build, the cavity sings, and ionization rises. Upward movement channels toward the higher chamber where the granite sits in layers. The faster the flow, the more it strips heat into the ceiling. Any burn would race where the geometry compresses it. That line, traced by soot and crust, points to a pivot point when the system crossed a threshold it could not manage. He turns off the flashlight. Letting the dark settle brings out another sense. The temperature here is even, but there's a weight to it, like the room carries memory. The engineer presses his palm to the wall. This is how people learned machines before screens. Ear to the casing, hand to the frame, reading the story of forces with skin and bone. In a place like this, the technique feels old and modern at once. There's a human cost hidden between these stones. If a machine once lived here and fed a city's lamps, its failure would not be academic. It would mean nights sinking into black, workshops quieting, water pumps still. It would mean the people who tended it, the keepers of procedures and timing, were either gone or left to explain a ruin to those who no longer believed the power was even possible. That's a different kind of silence. Not the quiet of a tomb, but the quiet after a plant goes offline. The theory that the final moment was triggered by a planetary disturbance has a grim echo. If what moved through the ground and sky that day was larger than any method this place could handle, then the failure isn't just a busted machine, it's a signal from the world itself. Supporters suggest a natural spike, geomagnetic storm, cosmic hit, poured extra energy into every conductive path. A tuned structure would be the first to feel it. Then the chemistry supplied the fuel. The rest is geometry and timing. Skeptics will say, where are the burn residues common to open flames? Where are the soot layers typical of oil lamps? How do we separate centuries of visitors from a single accident? These are fair questions, yet the streaks stand too regular under a ceiling too high for daily reach. The cracks keep a hard, straight edge. The salt sits where superheated moisture would stall and plate out. Even if the full script is not yet decoded, The letters look less like art and more like data. The engineer lifts the light once more and points it into the corner where one block meets another. There's a small shift where a line no longer lines up. It's a detail, and it matters. Machines record their failures in small misalignments. Bearings seize and shafts cut grooves. Here it's blocks out of true. It takes force to do that, and it takes an instant to make it visible. Long afterward, the stone holds the moment the way old vinyl holds a scratch that makes the needle jump. Think about the choice faced after a ruin like this. If the builders had the resources, maybe they tried to restart and found the tune would not settle again. Maybe the event that broke it also broke the environment that fed it. Or the keepers were lost, and those who followed built stories around a form they could no longer operate. A new culture would arrive, name rooms for kings and wrap function in ritual. The machine would become myth, the residue would stay. Back in the gallery, the char looks almost clean in the beam, like ink lines drawn with a steady hand. It's easy to forget how violent heat can be when it chooses its path and takes it. In tight spaces, hydrogen doesn't roar. It hurries. It strips and leaves patterns that a careful walker can still read long after the sound has died. Some whisper that later visitors found a great structure already quiet and tried to fit it into their world. If so, this is not the story of an empty tomb. It's the story of a system that hit its limit in a single night. And if stones can record the moment of failure, then perhaps they can also show another truth, waiting where physics meets architecture, urging us to look again at how mineral shape and energy might conspire in the dark. The lab is quiet enough to hear the soft tick of a wall clock. A graduate student steadies a small limestone pyramid on a non-metal table, fingertips dusted white from sanding its faces to match a precise angle. Across the room, a signal generator warms with a low, steady whir. The air smells faintly of ozone and photocopier paper. When the researcher flips a switch, a gentle radio tone fills the room. Not audible, but present in the way instruments twitch and lights blink. You watch coloured fields bloom on a monitor, curving like smoke toward the model's tiny chambers. They adjust the wavelength slowly. A wave that is too short slides past the shape like wind skimming a stone. Another, longer wavelength pushes across the model and gathers within it, as if the pyramid were a ladle and the field a river. At about 200 meters, roughly the same scale relationship to the model as a specific band of radio waves to the Great Pyramid, bright knots of energy cluster in 3 places on the simulation. One in the position of a king's chamber, one lower at the queen's chamber, and a hot, dense glow beneath the base. The grad student leans in and traces the hotspots with a capped pen, then glances up with a look that says, "This is not a tomb behaving like a tomb." Peer-reviewed work from 2018 modelled this exact effect. When radio waves with wavelengths that match the pyramid's scale meet its geometry, the structure doesn't scatter them at random. It shapes them. It gathers the fields into standing patterns and intensifies them at specific interior points and below the foundation. The math describes field localization. The screen turns the math into places you can point to. If the structure were only a pile of stones, you would expect noise. Instead, you get focus. That focus happens in the very rooms that earlier engineering theories flagged for other kinds of energy. The upper granite chamber where piezoelectric effects could spark under vibration. The lower room where chemical residues hint at reactions that could produce hydrogen. And the region under the base, where a ground plane in electrical terms would sit. Others dismiss the alignment of ideas as coincidence. Supporters suggest the overlap looks like a blueprint cross-check, where one independent method lights up the same nodes another method predicted. To make sense of it, think of antennas that rely on shape rather than complex parts. Engineers call them metamaterial structures when the geometry itself tunes fields. A patterned surface can steer waves, pinch them or hold them for a beat. You see simple versions in rooftop dishes and stealth coatings. The pyramid, by this reading, behaves like a passive antenna built from rock. No copper trace, no transistor. just angle, volume, and a thickness that invites certain wavelengths to settle into standing waves. Standing waves are the points in a room where a note hangs in the air and refuses to die. Clapping your hands in a stairwell and hearing a tone that seems to stay is one way to feel it. In the lab, a radio wave plays the role of the clap. The angles of the model take that wave and arrange it into a pattern of still crests and still troughs. Where crests meet, intensity spikes. Where troughs sit, fields fade. The pyramid's proportions create specific spots where those crests want to gather. If someone placed a chamber at one of those nodes, it would live inside a natural energy hotspot. This is where speculation begins. Some whisper the ancient builders encoded a field map into stone on purpose, choosing dimensions that align with accessible wavelengths in the environment. Critics counter that any large shape will have resonances, and that finding a match is a kind of cherry-picking. The lab work narrows the gap between the two positions by showing the hotspots form at 3 meaningful locations. Not everywhere, not evenly, and crucially at wavelengths that scale in a way that fits the real monument's footprint. Now the monitor displays a cross-section overlay. The student adjusts knobs until the brightest knot sits in the upper chamber. Another appears below. The team runs a comparison with alternative shapes: a cone, a box, a pyramid with altered angles. The hotspots shift or flatten out. Some shapes scatter energy with no clear focus. The precise pyramid geometry brings the knots back, like a dial turned to a known station. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. This is not proof of ancient power generation. It is a physical behaviour that makes a functional theory less hard to picture. If stone geometry can concentrate radio fields today, it is fair to ask what happens when you layer acoustic vibration from a chamber tuned to a specific note. Gases that ionize under charge and granite full of quartz that responds to stress with voltage. This is the part that keeps engineers awake. Geometry is cheap and stable. Materials last. The planet provides a steady background of electromagnetic noise. The machine, if it exists, would be a set of ways to persuade those natural fields to do useful work. A researcher wipes condensation from a chilled coaxial cable and checks a calibration sheet. She notes the wavelengths where the model shows clean localization. 200 to 600 meters perform best under their setup, with the strongest concentration near the 200-meter band. Those numbers scale to the full-size monument's base width. The result isn't mystical. It's a case of a large object acting like a cavity resonator for radio. The walls and angles decide where energy likes to sit. This sits neatly with a broader idea. The Great Pyramid's original shell was smooth white limestone. That shell would have acted like a weak insulator at radio frequencies, reducing leakage across the surface and keeping fields inside longer. Beneath the base, a foundation on wet ground could act as a sink, or a partner for those fields, especially at wavelengths that like to interact with water-saturated stone. The stack begins to look like a passive device that pairs with the Earth's skin. Tesla's work aimed at a similar partner. His tower was sited to interact with the ground and sky as a single system, feeding and receiving energy through the planet's natural currents. The lab model doesn't prove his dream, and it doesn't rewrite history. It shows that a pyramid shape at a specific scale couples with radio waves in a way that looks intentional to the eye. The echo between an ancient monument and a modern tower is the echo of a shared assumption. The world itself is part of the circuit. For a listener trying to sleep, it helps to use a simple image. Hold a curved mirror under sunlight and a bright dot appears on your hand. Move the mirror and the dot slides. Change the curve and the dot blurs. The pyramid model is a mirror for radio. The bright dot appears in the same inner rooms where other lines of evidence trail off and ask you to draw your own conclusion. You can move the dot by changing the wavelength or the angles. You can blur it by roughing the surfaces. Precision rewards you with a cleaner, tighter focus. An engineer places a finger on the model's apex and grounds it briefly. The field pattern shifts on the screen. This tiny touch changes boundary conditions, the way a hand on a guitar string stifles a harmonic. Then the finger lifts, and the knot returns to its perch above the lower chamber. It feels like coaxing a cat back into the same spot on the sofa, though there's no mind here to convince, only physics doing what physics does. Skeptics will be right to ask about scale effects, material variations, and the limits of simulation. Does a lab model, even one tuned with care, capture the irregularities of blocks packed by human hands? Does a sliced limestone sample stand in for a weathered monolith? Those are fair questions. The counterpoint is that the phenomenon persists across models and methods, change the thickness, and the frequencies shift, but the tendency to form interior hotspots keeps returning, as if the shape itself insists on being a lens. The more you look, the more the lab scene and the desert site start to overlap. The hotspot beneath the base resembles a region where a ground connection would be valuable. The upper knot sits where a mass of quartz-rich granite waits to be squeezed by vibration. The lower knot aligns with the place where chemical traces suggest a gas might form. Independent lines circle the same coordinates like birds finding the same thermal. The grad student logs the run numbers and reaches for a glass of water. The cup sweats in the lab's cool air. He takes a sip, sets it down on a coaster, and watches a tiny ring spread from the base. It's a small, human thing, but in a story about waves and shapes and the places where energy stands still, that ring says a lot. Harmonics don't ask for belief. They ask for dimensions. Some will say the tomb label remains the safest bet. A memorial can still have unintended resonances. A tomb can have strong geometry and, by chance, sit on a spot where radio waves behave oddly. Others will counter that the data points arrange like a quiet diagram of intent. Not a smoking gun, but a sketch left in stone, showing where to look and where to place the next piece. If stone geometry alone draws in ambient radio energy, that's an effect we can test and use. Add vibration, and charge begins to stir in quartz. Add a gas that ionizes, and low-energy fields become easier to feed and carry. Put the layers in sequence, and a primitive machine starts to take shape in the mind. Not primitive in skill, but in the way a flute is simple compared to a synthesizer, yet still fills a hall with sound. In the lab, the session winds down. The tone generator's fan falls to a soft breath. The student powers off the spectrum display, and the coloured knots fade to grey, then to black. The small pyramid sits where it sat at the start, chalky edges glowing faintly under fluorescent tubes. No thunder, no drama, just a clear hint that shape can harvest what the air already holds. The next step in this story doesn't require more simulation. It asks why a design that works as a passive field lens would sit silent for so long in public view, labelled a tomb while behaving like a device, and it asks why, in another age, a tower meant to ride the planet's currents failed to see the light of its own system. The monitor is dark now, but the map it showed lingers. The dots within stone, the dot below the base, and the thought that both ancient masons and a modern engineer were tracing the same pattern with different tools, each on the edge of a machine that wanted to breathe. Snow squeaks under your boots, the kind of cold that makes metal sing. Wardenclyffe rises out of the dark like a ribcage of iron, a bare lattice scratching the sky. The wind carries salt from the bay and a faint tang of rust. Chain link rattles in gusts, a thin clatter that marks the edges of the property. The tower stands unlit, its crown a shadow against low clouds. You can see the earthworks around the base, a ring of frost-stiff grass and a hummed quiet like a theatre after the lights go out. Breath clouds your scarf. Somewhere far off, a train horn drifts across the frozen flats and fades. Close your eyes for a second and the hollow yard fills. Coils buzz low, then climb until the air turns grainy. Blue arcs climb between metal spheres and the hairs on your arms lift. Tesla pivots at his desk, sleeve cuffs scorched from a test run, and taps a switch with 2 fingers. Assistants, faces smudged with graphite, hold rods over the ground and watch distant bulbs flare to life. No wires, only the strange beat of the room and the crackle of air. Visitors murmur at the edges, their skepticism softened by the simple fact of light. It looks like a parlour trick. It feels like a new rule for the world. The room smells of warm varnish, ozone, and wool coats drying by a stove. He wrote letters at that same desk until the nib wore smooth. J.P. Morgan's name sits at the top of several careful pages, each line trimmed of vanity and padded with diagrams and costs. The pitch begins as radio, a way to speak across oceans without cables, but the margin notes betray the deeper aim. Power without wire drawn from a planet-wide conductor would sidestep copper mines, save factories from feeding endless reels of cable, and shake the ledgers that kept those industries afloat. The moment this moves beyond signals, money thins. A short reply arrives on crisp paper. It isn't rude, it is final. The pullback doesn't shout, it moves in small emotions, credit lines tighten. An introduction to one investor cools into a polite decline. A rumour lands softly in a boardroom that a great mind has slipped into grandiosity. Newspapers treat the tower like a curiosity that overstayed its welcome, a kind of metal folly visible from the water. Engineers who once leaned in now fold their arms and call it impractical. A wire service blurb frames the project as a noble confusion. No one says stop out loud. Doors just start to shut on their own. Work slows. Winter arrives early and stays late. Tesla pays a machinist from his own pocket to finish a minor gear that no longer matters. In the yard, a labourer grips a thermos with both hands, blows steam into the cold, and watches his breath mingle with the breath of the tower, a broken rhythm. The substation hum that once soothed him has gone flat. A month later, he comes back to pick up his last pay, finds the gate locked, and leaves with a scrap of copper tucked into his coat lining. He tells himself it's a souvenir. The truth, perhaps, is that he doesn't want to let go. The end comes in practical shapes. A man with a clipboard points out beams, notes the bolts he'll loosen, then the points where explosive charges will bite. A car idles near the fence while men in dark coats talk about liability, not legacy. Local papers mention spy risk in a single sentence. The war gives every story a ceiling and a floor. No one prints the sound of the first blast, the deep stomach punch of the ground when the legs give. No one records Tesla standing back from the crowd, hat brim low, as the structure folds on itself and the last of the rivets sigh. When the dust settles, nothing hums. The quiet feels heavier than the metal. By spring the site looks like a scrapyard that resulted from a dream. Oak forms lie in snowmelt. A coil half buried in mud glints like a fossil bone. The main building still stands, brick and patient, but its windows stare. In a nearby room, ledgers and receipts sit in neat piles. His handwriting bends around numbers and drifts back to ratios and shapes. He keeps drawing. The tall frame, the ground connection, the skin of the sky as a capacitor. The drawings repeat, refine, repeat again. A pattern that won't let him let go. He leaves Long Island eventually. The tower goes to auctions and balance sheets. Years pass. He grows older in hotel rooms with stiff towels and thin soup, more often alone and still writing late into the night. He writes about resonance, about sending pulses into the earth and waiting for the return wave to lift and carry power along. He has said it many times in many rooms, yet now the audience is the radiator's hiss and the scratch of pen on paper. You can see him testing an idea with a fingertip on the desktop, tapping a beat that only he hears. In 1943, the door to his room opens and men step in with a firm purpose. They move carefully through papers, sketches, loose coils of wire, and boxes labelled in his old shorthand. Over 80 trunks go into custody. Some whisper that weapons hide in the math. The Office of Alien Property takes possession. A formal evaluation arrives in clean prose, part technical, part diplomatic. It says there is no immediate threat in these pages. Later, only 60 trunks find their way back to family. The rest drift into warehouses and whispers. It endures. A researcher at a desk decades later flips through copies and pauses on a line about how the planet is not merely a rock. He doesn't quote anything. He underlines the word resonance, then underlines it again, and writes in the margin, "Check Wardenclyffe grounding diagram." The note sits there like a quiet bell. Supporters suggest Tesla kept a private thread between his tower and the old stones of Giza, less romance than pattern recognition. Critics counter that the bridge leans too far into fiction. The argument does not change the scribbles in his notebooks, or the way he kept circling the same frequencies. Why cut a dream when it glows on the horizon and offers light without a bill? The answer rarely arrives with thunder. It wears suits and uses phones. Copper is not just metal. It is ownership of mines, rail lines, and factories full of hands. Coal is not just fuel. It is contracts, ships, and the clout of a sector that feeds cities. Wire is a network and a measure. Metered power keeps accounts tidy. A tower that makes distance irrelevant, that turns the planet itself into a carrier, loosens the grip of all of it. People with investments see not a miracle but a leak. The press loves a fool. A single photograph of an inventor feeding pigeons will run longer than a diagram of a resonant circuit. Jokes about lightning and ungrounded claims circulate. Colleagues who owe their own fame to more conventional machines nod gravely and say it's a pity. The same cycle meets other inventions that pledge too much too soon. It is one thing to dismiss a rumour. It is another to explain why it endures. Maybe because indifferent physics sits behind the talk, steady and patient, waiting for someone with stubborn hands. Wardenclyffe's last service is slower than its first. Crews haul iron down the road. The main shaft that reached into the aquifer is sealed. We don't get a tidy ending. We get a hole in the ground that remembers. A boy bicycles past the fence years later, stops, and presses his face to the mesh. He doesn't know who built it. He only knows that the place sounds different from the field next door. "It's the wind," his father says. The boy nods, but he isn't convinced. An older electrician tells a story in a diner near the harbour. He says he once saw bulbs glow on the sand with no wire attached. He sips his coffee and grins when his friend shakes his head. "Maybe it was the moon," the friend says, and they laugh. The tale has stretch marks. Still, the detail of where the bulbs lay never changes. Folklore grows where the official record keeps its hands clean. The same happens around older stones in hotter countries, where guides lower their voices at certain corners and let the air do some of the talking. A thin line runs through all of it. Big systems thrive on scarcity and measure. Machines that erase distance frighten people who profit from the space between. Some whisper that this is the quiet engine behind so many endings. Others dismiss it as a lens that makes every outcome look like a plot. Either way, the arc from promise to dismantling repeats. We see it in the field where a tower used to be. We see it when we walk narrow corridors in limestone that show heat scars and broken beams. One loss wears a tie, the other wears time. Stand again in that winter yard, the wreck long gone, the ground flat under new grass. The same wind runs through the trees and through the steel barrier that replaced the old fence. Your breath puffs and fades. A cold emptiness reaches across the open field and touches something deep, the way certain empty rooms hold more weight than full ones. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Human hands silence one tower with money and permits. The stones far away bear marks of a blow that did not care who paid for copper. If one end of the wire was cut by greed, the other snapped under the sky. That is the difference. That is also the echo. The night Tesla's tower went dark drifts into the same long dusk that once fell over an older machine, which may have met its end when the air itself turned violent. The next step is not in the lab or the ledger, but in ancient weather, the kind that carves stone and rewrites maps. Rain hammers the Sphinx enclosure before sunrise, a low grey sky pressing down as if the air itself has weight. The limestone walls drink it in. Sheets of water run off the ledges and plunge to the floor, filling shallow basins and cutting little channels that twist like veins. Your jacket soaks through at the shoulders. The stone face stares past you, calm and unreadable. Along the enclosure walls, grooves that are already deep take the new rain without complaint. They run straight down, clean and vertical, like someone combed the rock with a blade of water. When the storm eases, the smell of wet dust hangs in the cool air, and a guard rubs his hands together for warmth, knuckles white, as if this ancient place can still catch a chill. Those vertical cuts set up a quiet argument. In Egypt's dynastic age, the climate didn't do this. The usual weather wears stone sideways, with wind that scours and sand that scribbles across surfaces in long horizontal lines. Here the marks fall, straight as rain, overhangs rounded like old riverbanks, lower walls scalloped as if they once held standing water. Supporters suggest these patterns fit a wetter world. That would push the first shaping of this enclosure back into a time when heavy rainfall was normal, when seasons brought storms that lasted long enough to bite down these long channels. A geologist made that case in modern times, walking the trench with a hand on the rock and a notebook tucked under his arm. He pointed out where wind leaves corrugations and where water rounds and carves. Critics counter that later groundwater, or runoff from the plateau, could have done the job after the Sphinx was already in place. Yet the distribution of wear doesn't match a trickle from above. It sinks into corners, wraps around exposures, and fades where shelter would have kept it dry. You can read it with your fingertips. Smooth where flow persisted, rough where it broke and swirled, let the frame widen. Far to the north, on a wind-shaved hill in southeastern Turkey, great T-shaped stones stand in circles, Göbekli Tepe. They are not small, some weigh as much as a truck. They were set in place around 11,600 years ago, long before written records and long before farming took root in many places. The pillars carry foxes, birds and hands carved in low relief. You can walk there at dawn and see the carvings catch a pale line of light, and it feels less like a temple than a project management problem, solved by people who knew tools, labour and rhythm. If this level of organisation existed then, it loosens the timeline. Maybe building in stone happens earlier than we assumed. Now shift to ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, cores pulled from deep frozen layers show that global temperatures jumped and fell with shocking speed during the Younger Dryas. Around 9,700 BC by some counts, a sharp rise arrived within a human lifetime. The event began much earlier with a sudden drop, then ended in a spike. Scientists read these changes like tree rings for climate. Tiny bubbles trap ancient air. Ratios of oxygen isotopes mark warmth and cold. Some whisper that a solar outburst struck the planet near the end of this period, a flare strong enough to push radiation into the upper atmosphere and jolt Earth's magnetic shield. If the magnetosphere bends or thins under that kind of stress, electricity behaves badly. Lightning finds new paths, it scales up. Accounts from the speculative side describe continent-spanning discharge, arcs that would glass sand and scour mountaintops. There are places where stone looks burned or glazed, and people tell stories about rocks melted like candle wax. Others dismiss that as unrelated volcanism, or the work of ancient fire. Still, the scenario has its inner logic, a sky storm that throws energy at the ground until matter yields. Glaciers do not resist energy well. If you dump heat into their skin, they melt and break. When they break fast, they shed water in pulses that outstrip any river alive today. In the deep geological record, sea levels climbed hundreds of feet over the broader warming. A rapid pulse on top of that would hit coast like a moving wall. Ports, lowland towns, and anything built near the shore would drown or wash away. If a culture kept its workshops near sea lanes, as most do, those would vanish first. The map redraws itself. Survivors climb to higher ground and carry only what fits on shoulders. Think back to Giza. If the pyramid's interior once hosted hydrogen gas, if the stones were tuned to respond to sound and pressure, what would a planetary electrical surge do to such a system? An electromagnetic pulse running through bedrock could turn a careful resonance into a runaway. Valves, baffles, and carefully angled shafts might not matter if the driver is now the planet itself, pulsing beyond design limits. Superheated vapor can speed up chemical reactions. Hydrogen doesn't forgive. A system meant to hum at a precise amplitude could slam into detonation before anyone could reach a cutoff. The traces deep inside the pyramid keep that possibility alive. Salt crystallized in thick crusts on certain surfaces tells of water vapor flashing and then cooling on stone. Granite beams high above show clean fractures, some bowed as if pushed and held before release. These marks look like the aftermath of violent pressure. A seismic event might crack rock, but it usually shares the damage. Here, some paths remain neat and untouched, like halls ignored by the chaos. The pattern reads less like general ruin and more like a blowout inside a machine. The human part of the story lives in little images. A mason sets down a chisel and listens to the low ring of stone as a wind shifts. A woman wraps a child in a goat hair blanket when a storm rolls over the plateau, the air prickling against her skin. A crew chief counts steps on an incline, checks a mark with a reed, and hears a deep note in his chest that seems to answer from the walls. If the climate went wild in their lifetime, if lightning walked along the ground and the rivers rose and never fell, what choices did they have? Fortunate bands find caves. Others dig into hillsides. Fires burn cooler under rock. Coastal shelves that are dry today were different then. Stand on a cliff, and you can see where a broad plain would have stretched out, now buried under quiet water. If towns and knowledge centres sat near inlets and deltas, the sea took them in. Anything made of wood, reed, or clay washed apart. Stone lasts, but only if it sits high or heavy enough to resist. A power system tied to special sites. Fault lines, aquifers, crossings of Earth's natural currents could lose nodes one after another. The grid collapses, not by enemy action, but by geography. Stories keep the outline of events when measurements and records fail. Tales about a great flood exist in many cultures, far from each other in language and land. Boats riding over hills, cities swallowed in a day, fires in the sky. The details don't match, but the refrain does. The world changed fast and the old ways died. It's one thing to dismiss a rumour, it's another to explain why it endures. When people live through disaster, myth gives shape to memory that's too heavy to carry raw. From this angle, the great monuments become less like graves and more like surviving parts of a network. The Sphinx stares from a weathered pit that speaks of rain. The pyramid's interiors show load paths and stress zones that look engineered, not ceremonial. Supporters suggest that later dynasties found them, cleared sand, patched, and repurposed what they did not fully grasp. The skills they displayed elsewhere, colour, inscription, funerary rites, do not appear here in the same way. That mismatch might be culture layered over inheritance. You can test the weight of that thought with a small action. Run your hand across a stone ledge in the Sphinx Trench after a storm. Grit lodges under your nails. Water cools your skin. The vertical cuts look fresh, not because they are young, but because the form of the wound never stopped fitting the tool that made it. Falling rain. A guard leans on a broom and tells you the pit floods in winter. He laughs without humour and adds that pumps have to work hard. He knows the place breathes water. Back in the lab, a technician taps a pencil against a printed graph from an ice core. Peaks and valleys step across the page. The younger Dryas isn't a polite slope, it's a jagged move, a stumble in the line. The end is abrupt. If a solar event really landed its punch near that time, it could tie the climate spike to a change in Earth's electrical environment. That would fold two mysteries into one. Others dismiss the link as wishful stitching across distant data sets. Fair enough. Yet the pencil keeps tapping on the same sharp edge. A fisherman from a village on the Nile Delta pauses by his boat at dusk and points to the horizon, where he says his grandfather claimed fields used to stretch before the sea rolled in farther. Maybe the memory is part truth, and part the way old men condense years into a single tide. Maybe it hints at a longer line, a shoreline that has never kept still, a people who keep stepping back from the water's reach, taking their stories with them and leaving their tools to sink. Consider how a machine fails when outside forces drive it. A turbine spins beyond its rating, bearings heat and seize, casings bow, safety systems designed for normal faults sit idle while a bigger wave rolls through. If the pyramid's chambers and passages formed a tuned apparatus, a planetary surge could have done the same. Not sabotage, not mistake, just bad timing at a cosmic scale. The failure would look like ours do after a black swan event: burned traces, cracked members, and an eerie hush where motion used to be. Out on the plateau, night settles and a light wind dries the stone. The Sphinx becomes a darker shape against the starfield. When the breeze drops, you can hear a faint trickle from a drain at the edge of the enclosure, the last of the storm working its way out. It's a small sound in a large place, and yet it suggests a larger rhythm, one that once arrived not as a trickle but as a flood, not as a shower but as weather that redrew maps and rewrote calendars. Some whisper that the early Egyptians walked among these forms like we walk among power stations after the grid fails, aware it mattered, unsure how it worked, treating it with care and story. They built their own greatness on top, as any sensible culture would, using what remained. If that's true, it means we may be reading a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped and written over, with faint letters from a lost chapter still showing through the new ink. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens, a rain-cut trench that speaks to another climate, ice that marks a wild swing, a world where lightning may have come down in sheets, a sea that climbed fast, a machine that doesn't behave like a tomb. None of it settles the argument, but side by side the pieces echo. The storm over the Sphinx fades to a drip, and the stone exhales the day's damp. Somewhere, under sand and bedrock, more of that earlier story may wait, not gone, only hidden long enough for us to forget where to knock. Night air seeps through cracks in the plateau, cool and mineral, while far above the desert stars hold their patient glow. Deep under the Giza sands, you move through darkness lit only by the idea of a map made from particles. Myans, ghosts from space, drift through limestone and granite, tracing their quiet paths. On a laptop balanced on a crate, a technician with red eyes and a steady hand watches faint points gather into shapes, like rain finding the lines of an old city. The screen resolves slowly. A hollow forms where no room should be, a void nested in stone that was supposed to be solid from base to tip. By 2017, the outlines had sharpened enough for a single phrase to land, a large sealed cavity directly above the Grand Gallery. The numbers whispered the size, about 100 feet long, a height that could swallow a bus. Yet the images gave nothing else away. No doorway, no crawl space, no convenient stair. The void hung there like a breath held in the throat of the pyramid. Every other scan, thermal, radar from the edges, even endoscopes where thin channels allowed, came back with the same refusal. It's there. It does not tell you why. Official lines settled in quickly. A structural void, they said, perhaps a clever lightening of weight above the ascending corridor. Others dismiss more ambitious readings as fantasy. Yet the engineer in the corner, hands stained with dust and pencil graphite, sketches load paths on paper and shakes his head. Ancient builders rarely left 100-foot empty volumes without purpose. And if weight relief was the goal, why here? directly above a passage whose geometry already suggests careful acoustic work. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. 100 feet is a choice, not an accident. Ground-penetrating radar teams add their faint voices to the map. The readings come back with rectangles aligned on the pyramid's central axis. They hint at downward passages that cut away from known corridors, turning where no plan shows a turn. In late-night lab warmth, a graduate student wipes condensation from a thermal image where heat and cool meet along a jagged edge. The stone seems to breathe, as if air moves through a sealed body. Supporters suggest small channels or microfaults might be circulating air, not visible from the outside. Critics counter that sand temperature shifts can trick the sensors. The debate hangs, but the images pull eyes back to the same places. The words Hall of Records seep in from older lore. Not a museum, but a vault. Egyptian, Greek, and later Arabic tales refer to hidden knowledge buried beneath this plateau. Some whisper that the new cavity aligns with those stories. Others dismiss it as modern myth wearing ancient clothes. The technician from the first scan stays quiet and traces tunnel lines on translucent film laid over a satellite image. He marks where texts say a chamber should be, and where the munes say a chamber is. The lines don't match perfectly, but they rhyme. Maintenance logic nudges the myth aside and asks for wrenches and corridors. Complex systems need space to be serviced. If the pyramid functioned as a machine, where were the storage alcoves for chemicals, the bypass shafts, the galleries for tuning weights or resonators, the routes for workers who kept it steady? The unknown void above the Grand Gallery sits exactly where an access volume could monitor a noisy throat. Ground-level scans show long rectangles that would store not treasure, but supplies. You can almost hear footsteps that never echo now, a soft scuff of a jar slid along stone. Restrictions tighten the mood around the work. A request for more time inside the structure is returned with conditions. Another proposal to micro-drill from a safe angle, just a straw-width opening for a camera probe, goes unanswered for months. A third is denied outright. The researcher who drafted the safety plan runs a hand through his hair and stares at the ceiling. It feels like standing outside a locked door with the key in reach, told to look through the keyhole and be content. Some whisper that secrecy protects the pyramid from reckless damage. Others suggest it protects a narrative from new facts. Seismic readings widen the map beyond the main monument. Hammer taps and faint thumps travel through the rock while geophones listen. Discontinuities ripple back like echoes off a buried harbour wall. They suggest straight cuts in bedrock too clean for nature. Satellite thermal images, taken at dawn when rock releases its night-held chill, reveal cool lines that run beyond the footprint of the pyramid and bend toward the Nile. The shapes imply tunnels that extend into the plateau, and maybe beyond it. A desert that looks empty begins to sketch itself as a limestone city. Inside a quiet office hung with topographic maps, an older civil engineer lays tracing paper over a cross-section drawing. He sketches the Grand Gallery, the known chambers, then adds the new void above. He draws small side cavities where supplies might have been stored, and a narrow corridor that could have allowed technicians to tune the resonance of a stone ceiling. He circles the area beneath the pyramid where water flows and writes service shaft in the margin. The result doesn't look like a tomb, it looks like a plant diagram. The Hall of Records returns, but this time as logistics rather than legend. If knowledge was stored anywhere, it would be nested where maintenance intersected with control. Not in the public path, but in the off-hours route no tourist ever walks. Eastern texts speak of repositories sealed against flood and fire. Western retellings wrap those lines in prophecy. Here on the map, the thought reduces to a simple question. Where would you place the manuals for a machine that could harm the city if it were misused? Not in the open. Somewhere accessible only to those who knew how to listen to stone. The human scale comes back in a small story. A field technician, sleeves rolled, kneels by a sand-blown vent cap near the plateau's edge. He loosens a rusted bolt, leans down, and feels a faint breath of cooler air touch his cheek. He closes his eyes and counts. 3 heartbeats, then a whisper of movement again, as if pressure equalizes in a hidden space. He tightens the cap, marks a dot in his notebook, and walks away without a word. The desert looks the same, his stride is different. What happens if you treat these discoveries as pages of a technical manual rather than a gallery of mysteries? The muon map shows structural volumes, the radar hints at corridors, thermal images whisper about air where no hallway should exist. Take them together, and the voids begin to act like access and control. If the pyramid coupled with the groundwater below and the sky above, the infrastructure to manage that coupling would not be symbolic. It would be concrete, stone gates, buffer rooms, relief chambers, and tunnels large enough to move materials that could react or burn. Others dismiss this as overreach, a story built from shadows. They urge caution. Muon images can blur edges, radar misreads, thermal flow can be misinterpreted. They're right to be careful. The desert eats certainty, yet the shapes persist across methods. The big void above the Grand Gallery sits where it sits, independent of theories. It does not move to please or disappoint anyone's model. It waits. The mood shifts when you compare that waiting to Tesla's habit of building access beneath his towers. Wardenclyffe had service tunnels, grounding wells, and cramped spaces where he tuned coils by ear, listening for the right bark and whine of a spark. If a resonance machine existed at Giza, quartz and limestone would be the coils, water the ground, and the access voids the tune rooms. The analogy is imperfect. It doesn't need to be perfect to be useful. A conservation worker who has spent years stabilising the gallery stairs speaks in practical terms. You keep a system running by getting to the places that break first. You reduce pressure spikes, you vent gases, you store reagents far from heat, and you keep a path clear for those who know what to do when the pitch goes wrong. He runs a gloved hand along a step worn in a way that walking cannot explain. Not 1 million visitors, but 1,000 careful trips with weight carried by people who knew to hug the wall. That kind of wear tells a different story. Secrecy breeds tales, but it also grows out of small banal reasons. Insurance, politics, permits, pride. The plateau is both a national symbol and a working site. Opening new cavities carries risk. Drilling could collapse an ancient lintel. A rumour could collapse careers. The line between protection and obstruction is thin and shifts with light. That said, a pattern emerges. Requests to study the big void more closely stall. Proposals to trace the rumoured tunnels meet paperwork that sours and curls in the sun. At dusk, when heat leaves the stones and the plateau takes on its nightly cool, the muon instruments keep counting. Cosmic particles do not care about permits. They record what lies in their path and share it one faint mark at a time. Over months the marks gather, and a second minor cavity near the primary void hints at a patterned array, rather than a single accident. As if spaces were designed as a pair, a balance above a delicate throat. Think of the voids not as empty, but as shapes with tasks, an overhead release that stabilizes vibrational load. A monitoring corridor where a tone could be heard within the stone and adjusted by small changes. A moved block, a loosened wedge. A side pocket where chemicals stayed cool before being moved upward. Supporters suggest this language fits the readings better than random whole. Critics counter that ancient builders used many tricks, and that we should not attribute intent where stress and geometry suffice. It's wise counsel. The map still leans toward design. Beneath the plateau, underground lines wander toward other monuments. Seismic hints suggest a corridor that brushes the Sphinx enclosure, then slides toward the river's older course. Satellite imaging adds thin threads that join to make something like a network. It may be nothing more than caves and old cuts, or it may be a city's service spine, the unseen backbone of a complex that worked with water movement and ground current, guided by hands that understood pressure and tone the way a musician understands the neck of a violin. The technician from the first night closes his laptop and wraps a scarf against the chill. The desert returns to its long hush. He has no proof to offer, only patterns that hold their shape across tools, and a sense that the void above the Grand Gallery is not an accident. Somewhere in another century, a man in a worn suit filled a notebook with resonance counts and coil ratios, and built access tunnels to tamper with the Earth's quiet roar. 2 jobs separated by millennia, 2 maps of hidden spaces serving the same idea. If the plateau shelters a manual for an old machine, none of us have read it yet. The pages show themselves in fragments. Void here, corridor there, a breath of cool air on a sun-baked ledge. The story doesn't need a final page to move forward. It needs a key and the patience to listen. And perhaps, somewhere under the sand, a door waits that opens not to treasure, but to the instructions for turning stone and water into power again. The clock on the wall barely ticks, its second hand sticking on the cold. You sit at a metal workbench under a lone desk lamp, the room washed in that late-night blue that makes edges look softer than they are. One palm holds a chunk of Aswan granite, rough and cool, grained with tiny glints where quartz catches the light. The other hand steadies a brittle blueprint, Wardenclyffe's grounding field, edges curled, coffee ring ghosting the margin. The air smells faintly of dust, old paper, and a trace of solder from an iron that cooled hours ago. Outside, the campus is asleep. Inside, 2 worlds press against your fingertips. You run your thumb along the stone and feel the grit turn to a smoother seam. The paper rasps as you line a copper grid on the drawing over the bench edge. Lines and lattices, grain and crystal, separate by 5,000 years, and yet the diagram in your hand, copper veins plunging into wet ground, mirrors a patterned scholar's map beneath Giza. Porous limestone above, granite heart within, and groundwater running like a hidden river just below. It's a quiet rhyme. Almost a joke shared across time. Here's the shadow that refuses to leave. 2 civilizations far apart learn the same kit of parts. Quartz to squeeze out charge when it vibrates. Copper to draw and release. Limestone as a natural jacket to keep energy from bleeding away. Aquifers for grounding and charge exchange. And both aim their work at resonance. Those sweet spots where a push becomes a wave, and a wave becomes a method. Supporters suggest this pattern feels too precise to be a run of coincidences. Others dismiss it as selection bias, the mind finding faces in clouds. The truth perhaps sits in the way your hands hesitate, stone in one, blueprint in the other, waiting for a bridge to appear. Now the human cost rises through the floorboards. Tesla's tower didn't just fail, it was cut down. The investor who once backed him understood the math that runs empires. If power arrives without wires, copper's price goes slack. If you can send energy through the ground, you sell fewer meters and bill fewer kilowatt hours. The revenue model evaporates. A banker's pen can do what storms cannot. Funding dries up, and then the wrecking crew shows. The steel falls, and with it a version of the future. Meanwhile, the ancient machine, if machine it was, met another kind of gatekeeper. Not a boardroom, the sky. Some whisper the first suppression came from beyond our walls. They point to the Younger Dryas boundary, a litter of clues laid down in soil and ice, burn layers, strange carbon beads, damaged quartz, signs of something high and hot rolling through the atmosphere. A solar event large enough to stress Earth's magnetic shield would have driven currents along the crust. Energy systems tuned to the planet might surge beyond control. If chambers at Giza carried hydrogen and lived by resonance, a planetary pulse could push them past safe thresholds. The scars in those upper stones make that idea hard to shrug off. Critics counter that climate cycles and local faults explain more than any cataclysm. The debate keeps its slow burn. The engineer at the bench, let's keep you there, turns the stone and taps it lightly with a screwdriver handle. A faint ring answers, more felt through the fingers than heard. In older days, craftsmen tested porcelain that way. Good pieces sing. You hold the blueprint closer. Thin lines show copper rods sunk into wet sand down to bedrock. If the ground moves with water, it carries electric waves better. Tesla knew that. Some whisper others knew too. Not through equations on paper, but through slow experiment with rock, sound, and the steady beat of groundwater. If both systems died, they left different tombstones. One is steel torn down by men, one is stone fractured from within. When energy systems fail, you don't just lose convenience, you lose habit. A family that counts on steady current rearranges its days when the lights stop. Shops shut early, hospitals ration. At a bigger scale, a society that leans on a machine can fall when the machine stops humming. The cracked beams above a chamber, massive, simple, and wounded, feel like grief in architecture. Wardenclyffe's empty foundation is a gentler sadness, a circular patch of earth that once expected a tower's weight and never felt it again. Two kinds of quiet, both heavy. Let the frame widen. We're taught that progress rises in a neat line, fire, steam, wire, microchip. But the pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Discovery comes in waves. The first crest learns how to coax charge from quartz and make ground into a conductor. It leaves markers and methods, and perhaps a disaster. The next crest climbs the same slope with new words and different tools, and runs into a gate marked profit. After the break, we sift, rebuild, and name it all firsts again. It's sobering to think our straight road is really a loop with long shadows across the turns. Myths keep whispering at the edges. Tales of a city that vanished under one night of water. Stories of skyfire that taught and then punished. Flood memories in cultures that never met. All telling of a world that drowned and of bright ages ending in a roar. Skeptics remind us that rivers burst their banks in many places. But a riddle remains. Why do so many stories agree on speed? The fall coming not as a slow fade, but as a drop. The bedtime mind is a good place to hold that question without forcing an answer. Control sits at the core. In one world, ancient builders may have balanced a machine with the sky itself. They kept charge in stone and water and called on it with sound. If a storm of plasma tore across the planet, control slipped from human hands in one long day. In another world, the control rested in ledgers. Wireless, unmetered energy would turn a market inside out. Owners of copper, coal, and wires saw a future with their names scratched out, so they scratched first. Different methods, same outcome. The machine goes quiet, the people adapt. The record falls silent. Walk the numbers. If energy could be tapped freely, industries built on scarcity would wither. Copper mines, cable mills, wire strung across continents, coal cars, oil tankers, a tangle of billing networks and plants. You can see why any proposal for unmetered power would be treated as an existential threat. That's not a secret cabal. That's incentive, plain and cold. Supporters suggest this is why certain breakthroughs stall at the funding stage, why patents vanish into private vaults, why labs that once hummed now serve as museums. Others dismiss this as romance for the misfit genius. Either way, a tower went down. Either way, a stone machine cracked. There's a quieter thought underneath the big one. Maybe the secret isn't energy. Maybe it's custody. Who decides when the switch flips? Who owns the means to light a city and who pays for the glow? If the answer spreads too wide, old structures crumble. If the answer narrows to a few hands, the rest of us rent our light by the hour. Every civilization that touches the deep currents of the earth seems to arrive at the same fork, share or control. The outcomes write our histories more than any single invention ever could. You turn the granite again and see a faint line of mica sparkling like a thin stream at dusk. A pencil sits near your wrist. You draw one more line on the blueprint, a cross mark where copper meets wet sand. Mind drifts to the old stories. A scribe in a temple library copying a diagram he doesn't fully grasp. A mason running his palm across a dressed block to feel if it truly lies flat. A financier tapping ash from a cigar onto a ledger, ink drying beside a number that means no. The human grip is the hinge in all of this. The instrument can be as grand as a pyramid or as fragile as a tower's steel lattice. Hands guide both. Hands end both. If you accept the wave pattern, a different timeline appears. Before dynastic kings, before bronze, a culture learns the planet's pulse. They seed the ground with stone that sings and chambers that breathe. Catastrophe rips it apart. Fragments survive under sand and inside stories. Millennia later, a man walks alone on Long Island nights, hearing a faint ring in the soil, when his device pushes the right tone into the earth. He names the trick in the language of coils and cycles. He builds. He asks for money. He misjudges where permission lives. Our age inherits both the ruins and the warning. Flood myths echo, but so do ruins. And his walls with their puzzle-fit stone, old forts with glassy surfaces charred by heat no campfire makes. Sites that sit on waterlines and fault zones, as if builders cared less about pretty views and more about what moves unseen underfoot. This isn't proof, it's a chorus, and it hums the same refrain. You can follow it inland to deserts and seacoasts and down into caves where even now, water threads through rock and turns the world into a slow, wet circuit. Your wristwatch ticks again, cured for the moment. The lamp warms the back of your hand. The granite needs no warmth. It keeps its own. You lean the blueprint against the stone, and the edges meet in a small, unplanned symmetry. The feeling isn't triumph, it's closeness, as if the line between old and new is thinned just enough to let a single idea pass through. Some whisper that civilizations before us mastered this, lost it, and left clues not for worship but for repair. Others dismiss that hope and say we like stories more than we like work. Between those poles stretches the night. Here in that night a pattern waits. Quartz for charge, copper for path, limestone for jacket, water for ground, frequency for key. Those pieces do not belong to any one age. They sit under our feet, and they do not forget. If the past holds a blueprint, it has survived in fragments, a cracked chamber, a cleared foundation, a scatter of tales about skyfire and suns that misbehaved. You don't need certainty to hear the rhyme. You need patience and a willingness to read stone like paper and paper like stone. You switch off the lamp. The afterimage hangs for a breath, green and grainy. The room cools at once. Out in the dark you can almost hear water moving under the building. A low thread through soil, easy to miss unless you listen for it. If the cycle is real, it doesn't end with one tower or one pyramid. It stretches across maps and eras, leaving hints in bedrock and blueprints alike, inviting anyone awake at this hour to follow the line to whatever ruined thresholds came before. Dawn climbs over a high plateau in southeastern Turkey. The air tastes cold and mineral. Wind brushes the skin like a fine file, and dust lifts in slow, curling sheets from a ring of exposed bedrock. You run your hand along a pillar the shape of a T, its face carved with foxes and cranes, and a bent arm that holds no tool, only mystery. This is Göbekli Tepe, older than cities, older than writing, a place where stone kept stories before clay ever held a mark. The pillars are huge, set in circular enclosures, and they lean in like elders conferring. No roof, just sky. The carving sits shallow but crisp, as if weather agreed to spare them. A worker in a faded cap brushes silt from a set of talons, pauses, then taps the stone with his knuckle. The note is dull and steady. Out here, you expect emptiness. Instead, you find intent. Let the frame widen. The pattern doesn't stop at this hill. Far to the west, Newgrange wakes with winter light funneling down a passage to a small chamber that still smells faintly of damp soil and old grass. In the high Andes, Sacsayhuaman's polygonal blocks meet on seams so tight a razor can't settle between them, each face finished with a gentle bow that makes the joints lock under their own weight. In Lebanon, the platform at Baalbek holds stones that sit like parked ships, each one massive enough to make modern cranes shy. Off Japan's Yonaguni coast, a staircase drops in tidy terraces toward blue-green depths where fish sweep along edges that look more chiselled than eroded. In northern Scotland, the walls of certain forts ripple like melted glass. At each site, the stones keep their own kind of memory, and the air carries a low, ocean-soft hush that feels charged even when nothing moves. Supporters suggest those memories link through shared engineering. They point to consistent signs, blocks trimmed with a precision that sidesteps simple hammer and chisel work, ground chosen not for ceremony alone but for what lies beneath. Water channels, fault lines, regions where Earth's own currents graze close to the surface. Many of the stones test rich in quartz or feldspar, mineral lattices known to generate charge under pressure. Some whisper the builders sought out places where the planet already hums, then shaped rock to match that song. Others dismiss this as pattern hunting across unrelated sites. The human need to find a thread in any tangle. Even so, the thread keeps catching light. At Göbekli Tepe, you watch a conservator press a small sensor against the base of a pillar. She writes a number in the margin of a smudged notebook, lips pressed thin, eyes tracing the arc of carved animals as if the figures might explain the reading. She taps the page twice, thoughtful. Electromagnetic surveys at different ancient complexes often show small but repeatable anomalies, drifts in the local field, telluric currents pooling like groundwater at a bend in a river. In some circles of standing stone, compasses quiver. At others, rods used by practical farmers to find water tilt with a stubborn confidence. Critics counter that geology alone explains these quirks. Granite carries its own magnetism, they say, and underground streams rewrite the map without asking permission. The truth, perhaps, is that choice of location mattered, and that the builders knew something about how ground answers to shape. You step into a low barrow in Ireland. The chamber air is cool and close, smelling of peat and wet leaves. Your footfalls come back to you a fraction later, as if the chamber likes to hold the sound before letting it go. A guide, hands rough, voice quiet, hums a single note that thickens the space, then fades with a long, velvety tail. Acoustic archaeologists have measured responses like this, and noticed that many megalithic rooms keep steady reinforcement around a narrow band of low frequencies. Some whisper that those tones echo the planet's own background pulse, the slow electromagnetic beat that rides between ground and sky. The claim is controversial. Still, when you stand there, the air itself seems to listen. Follow the water. Many of these sites sit where spring surface or where old riverbeds run underfoot. A mason in Peru kneels beside a channel cut into stone, fingers wet, tracing the curve where flow would accelerate. Water in motion carries charge. Water under pressure vibrates surrounding rock. Pair that with a ring of hard, quartz-rich blocks, and the whole assembly starts to behave like a tuned device. That's the theory put forward by those who see an engineering pattern, and while it stretches beyond consensus, it has a tidy internal logic. Ground becomes the conductor. Stone shapes become the interface. The sky plays a part too, not as a godly dome, but as a resonant shell that answers to what the ground sends up. In Scotland, a volunteer caretaker at a vitrified fort runs a finger along a wall that once endured heat fierce enough to soften it. He keeps his voice low, out of habit. The stones fuse in places, a glassy weld that looks accidental and designed at the same time. Explanations range from warfare to ritual burning. A quieter line of thinking walks beside them. If people pushed energy through stone, even clumsily, perhaps fire was the side effect of an experiment that only had to work once. That idea feels bold. It also sits in the mind like a pebble in a shoe. asking for a reason why so many walls share the same scar. Across these sites, survey maps tell similar stories. Lines of monuments lean towards solstices and equinoxes, with a precision that's hard to call luck. But the sky may have served another role beyond calendaring. Supporters suggest celestial events could have acted as cues, moments when a shared system woke together, coordination by the firmest clock humans could see. If that's true, then stone circles and terraces weren't just eyes pointed upward. They were switches, tuned to a pattern that stitched the world into one fabric, with rivers as wires and fault lines as nodes. Stand again at Göbekli Tepe and look at the pillar bases. Their sockets sit on bedrock, not loose soil. The stability feels overdone, like foundation work for a machine that cannot wobble. A worker lifts a chalk line and snaps it clean. Dust sneaks into your throat and tastes faintly metallic. Many pillars wear belts carved across their middles. Some carry animal reliefs raised just enough to catch dawn and dusk. If the carvings held meaning, it might have been story, or code, or just the maker's pride. But the arrangement, their height, their spacing, their stubborn geometry, hints at function that outlives the scene on their faces. Widen the view once more. In the desert southwest of Egypt, the stones of Nabta Playa mark alignments that match key points in the year. A few stand in strings that trace subsurface water. In Ireland, the chambers of passage tombs sit atop ridges where underground flows gather. In the Andes, high terraces ride along seams in the rock where moisture seeps. The builders didn't pick spots at random. They worked with ground that already did half the job, then coaxed the rest. It's a way of thinking that feels familiar to anyone who has tuned a guitar string or set a radio dial. You don't make the wave, you meet it. The classical story of monuments says worship came first, then stone. The older story the stones themselves tell is quieter. It suggests that knowledge about how Earth carries energy may have arrived early, in bits and rhythms, and that the dance with it grew elaborate before writing ever had a chance to record the steps. None of this is settled, yet the evidence of skilled hands, careful measurements, and a persistent taste for certain materials adds weight to the idea that someone somewhere was building with rules that are still legible if you tilt your head. Now place a modern figure beside these old works. A man in a dark suit walks the grounds of Long Island, eyeing the spot where groundwater nears the surface and the soil packs dense. He sketches a tower that couples to the earth beneath it instead of the city around it. Different age, different tools, same instincts. When you stand at Wardenclyffe's ruined footprint and think of quartz, water, and resonance, the map of ancient stone draws itself across the grass almost by habit. This is not proof, it is a rhyme. In Peru, a stonemason leans his shoulder into a boulder that doesn't budge, laughs, and pats it as if it were a stubborn ox. In Turkey, a young archaeologist wipes her hands, sits on a low wall, and watches sunlight spill across a standing pillar, the carving shifting from flat to sharp as the angle changes. In Scotland, the caretaker locks the gate and pockets the key with a soft clink. Those small human gestures feel closer to the truth than any diagram. People did this, with hands and stubbornness and some kind of rulebook that may have blended utility and myth until the two couldn't be teased apart. If these were nodes in a wide system, there had to be signals and safeguards, maybe even failures. A global network, if it existed, would bruise easily under the weight of flood, heat, or the slow, grinding loss of teachers. When you imagine a line of stones that once guided a kind of power, you also have to allow for the day it didn't. The wind would still cross the hill, the chambers would still answer to a voice, but the pattern would be gone. The idea carries a quiet cost. It means civilization might rise not in a staircase but in loops. People learn the ground, shape it to sing, then lose the song and keep the shapes. Later builders inherit the tune as a hum in their bones and try again in a different key. Critics counter that this romance ignores clear timelines, that we should be cautious with leaps that connect far mountains with one string. They're right to ask for care. It's one thing to hear echoes, It's another to insist the same singer always stood at the centre. Still, you stand at dawn on that Turkish hill, and your breath fogs. The carvings look back with steady eyes carved thousands of winters ago. The sound of your steps is small against the open air. Across oceans and ages, other stones hold other rooms with the same indifference to time. If there was an instruction manual, it might not be lost. It might simply be written in a language that talks through texture, spacing, and the way water finds its level. And if that manual survives in stone rather than paper, then the next page may wait where ruins meet bedrock, and the air carries the faintest hint of static, as if something long quiet is testing its voice again. Night air presses against your skin as you step back into the king's chamber at 3 a.m. The granite feels cool, almost damp under your fingertips. Dust hangs in the beam of a small flashlight and drifts like slow snow. The room holds a peculiar hush, thicker than quiet, as if the stone itself is listening. You steady your breath. Every sound lands and lingers, then slips into a faint after ring that fades against the hard planes of the walls. You run your hand along the coffer. The edge is worn smooth, colder than the room. Somewhere far below, water moves with the patience of old rivers. A faint mineral scent rides up through the stone pores. The chamber's proportions assert themselves without words, lengths and angles that feel intentional, tuned. You can't shake the sense that you're inside a device that once waited for a switch. Now let the frame widen. A system emerges when you trace the paths. Down below, the room we walked through in the last hour, the so-called Queen's Chamber, behaves less like a chapel and more like an engine bay. Supporters suggest it was tasked with one thing: making hydrogen. Not by magic, but by chemistry routed through narrow shafts that climb like conduits. If so, gas would rise through the heartline of the structure, light and eager, ready to interact with pressure, sound, and charge. Ahead, the Grand Gallery stands in memory like a throat prepared to sing. Long, tapering, ribbed with ledges that look less decorative than functional, it acts like an acoustic booster. The cross-section narrows just enough to corral waves into order. Some whisper that tuned devices once lived on those shelves. Resonators, perhaps, that drove a controlled flood of vibration upward. Even if they're gone, the geometry still demonstrates a purpose. Rooms that behave like instruments rarely appear by chance. Back here in the King's Chamber, the stone is the story. Aswan granite hosts a forest of quartz, crystals embedded like a million tiny springs. When you strike them with pressure or sound, they answer with charge. This is the piezoelectric trick we use in watches and ignition lighters, stretched to architectural scale. The claim is simple. Vibrate enough granite in phase, and the charges add like a choir hitting the same note. The wall becomes a slow battery. The ceiling beams become conductors. The coffer shifts from box to coupler. Now pull outside the stone envelope. The limestone casing, once bright, tight and polished, works like an insulator. It isolates the internal reactions from the world and keeps leakage low. Beneath everything, the water table forms a ground plane. Wet limestone is not just geology. It's a steady return path that closes an electrical loop through Earth itself. A structure, a shell, a ground. The outline of a transmission device rolls into view. Hold that sketch in your head, then slide a second drawing over it. Wardenclyffe rises on the page. A tower tied to an aquifer. Copper veins driving into wet sand. Coils tuned to a fundamental planetary rhythm. The overlay is eerie. Same reliance on groundwater as ground. Same obsession with resonance as the governing rule. Same strategy of insulating the active core from the surroundings to reduce loss. The language differs, but the grammar matches. You remember the research note that nudged this line of thought. Nikola Tesla looked at old stone not just as ruins, but as clues to Earth's energy. That's not a fairy tale claim. It's the engine of his project, a pursuit of wireless power that treats the planet like a conductor waiting for a nudge. The tower and the pyramid share a stubborn list of parts. water tables for grounding, conductive cores, insulating shells, and resonant cavities that answer to precise tones. Critics counter that similar problems often yield similar solutions. Maybe so. Yet the correspondences stack until the pile asks for a better explanation. Here is the hard asymmetry. Both machines ended in violence of a kind. In the pyramid, deep scars and fractured beams mark a final moment that pushed past safe limits. In New York, the metal lattice met explosives and the ground shuddered for different reasons. Not a runaway wave, but a demolition order. One failure climbs from physics, the other falls from finance. The outcomes rhyme, the causes do not. This pattern echoes wider than two projects. When people aim at unmetered energy, forces gather. Some whisper that chaos from the sky ended the ancient attempt. Solar rage, field collapse, a cascade that drove a stone machine into overdrive. In the modern era, the winds were quieter and more human. Funding pulled, contracts voided, a tower left to rust until it met dynamite. Different storms, same hush afterward. Set the diagrams aside and listen to the chamber. The frequency reported by careful listeners here, A at 440 Hz, feels like a key left in the lock. Tesla tuned his systems with ruthless attention to resonance, hunting for Earth's sweet spots. Supporters suggest this shared pitch isn't coincidence but method, a practical choice embedded in two designs separated by time. Others dismiss that link as romantic numerology. Still, your ear catches the tone and the stone seems ready to answer. A small habit from lab days returns. You press a knuckle softly to the wall and hum under your breath, barely a sound at all. The note grows in your chest and moves into the granite like a ripple. For a moment, the room grips it and returns a shaded version. It's subtle, and maybe it's just your bones vibrating. But the feeling bridges the pages, a human feed into a larger cycle. This is where the blueprint hardens. Queen's Chamber as hydrogen generator, Grand Gallery as acoustic amplifier, King's Chamber as piezoelectric converter and charge organizer, limestone casing as dielectric armor, aquifer as grounding matrix. The system reads not as myth, but as a chain of cause and effect that uses water, sound, gas and crystal to move energy through matter. If a civilization wanted wireless power without copper webs, this is one path. The counterpoint deserves a calm seat at the table. Archaeology assigns religious and ceremonial functions based on tradition and context, and not without reason. Tombs, processions, rites, these left real traces across Egypt. Yet this structure's internal choices keep dragging the mind back to function. The difference may lie not in belief, but in inheritance. People reach ruins and give them stories that fit the current world. Machines, silent long enough, become altars. Small pencil sketches in your pocket notebook. You draw the tower's grounding field next to the pyramid's base casing, then shade the water lines under each with the same blue. Copper here, granite there, but both playing the role of conductor. Same verb, new nouns. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Some whisper that Tesla wasn't alone on this path, that he was completing a circuit drawn long ago, guided by physics more than history. The claim feels grand, but the hum of the idea is steady. If two designs converge on the same materials and the same behaviours, maybe they're footprints of one principle walking across eras. It would explain the familiarity that engineers report when they stand under the corbelled vault or walk the sandy ground where the tower once stood. You slip the pencil back. The Great Pyramid stands outside the window of time, its casing long gone but its bones intact. Wardenclyffe is a foundation and a few old photographs, yet they talk to each other across the gap. One speaks with rock and water, the other with coil and wire. Both speak resonance, both speak grounding, both speak the stubborn dream of drawing power from the planet without a bill at the end of the month. If there is a lesson in the twin endings, it sits quietly. When a builder approaches free flow, something answers. In one age, it is the sky's temper. In another, it is the calculus of profit. The actors change. The motive, control, doesn't. The record falls silent and we inherit the hush. Your palm stays on the granite a second longer. The cool climbs into your skin. A thought arrives without hurry. Perhaps the secret never vanished. Perhaps it's scattered into stone, water, and a few schematics. What it needs is not permission, but a careful hand and a patient ear. You step toward the passage. The air grows a degree cooler. Somewhere, water slides through limestone veins like a soft wire. If the blueprint lives, it's simple and stubborn at once, and the door it opens may be as close as the next person willing to tune a note and listen until the stone answers.